What if a maestro's greatest talent was also his greatest curse? This is a story of forbidden love, music, and hidden secrets from the past that will strike a deep chord in your heart. Do you believe true love can be born from the deepest pain? Then stay with me until the end. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, turn on the notification bell, and get hyped so our moving romantic stories can reach even more people. He was the embodiment of discipline. Every gesture, every chord, calculated like a perfect equation. But the maestro's heart carried a silence not even music could fill. Until the day a violinist dared to play not just his scores, but also his scars. Snow fell in lazy flakes over Toronto. But inside Roy Thompson Hall, the tension was arctic. The kind of cold that didn't come from the Canadian winter, but from the presence of a man who could turn talented musicians into nervous children. Elliot commanded the orchestra like a general, standing before soldiers on the verge of failure. There was no room for error, no room for interpretation, only the sheet music, the baton, and the slicing silence that followed every off-key note. The rehearsal hall smelled of polished wood and that peculiar mix of violin rosin and restrained sweat. The yellow ceiling lights cast long shadows across the empty audience chairs, silent witnesses to another brutal rehearsal. Third movement. Bar 52, his voice echoed, deep and precise like a scalpel. Can someone explain why the cellos came in half a beat early? No one answered. 43 musicians stared at their sheet music as if the notes might shield them from the maestro's restrained fury. Elliot never needed to yell. He never had to. There was something in his gray eyes that did the job for him. A coldness that could freeze the air around him. He wore a black turtleneck sweater and impeccably tailored slacks. Everything about him was meticulously arranged. From the slicked-back gray hair to the upright posture that not even 10 hours of rehearsal could bend. Again, he raised the baton, and 43 people held their breath in unison. And this time, try to remember Brahms didn't compose this to be played like the soundtrack to a cheap horror movie. Stephen, the pianist, hid a crooked smile behind his score. He was one of the few who could find humor in the maestro's barbs. Maybe because he'd worked with Elliot long enough to know that beneath that armor of perfectionism was, well, just more armor, layer after layer of it. The music began again, and for 3 glorious minutes the orchestra sounded as it should. The violins danced in perfect harmony. The cellos entered right on time. The woodwinds did their part with precision. It was beautiful. It was correct. It was utterly empty. Elliot lowered the baton and dismissed them all with a tired wave. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late. The musicians filed out in respectful silence, packing up their instruments with the haste of people fleeing a battlefield. In 5 minutes, the hall was empty, except for Elliot and Stephen, who was pretending to reorganize his sheet music with suspicious slowness. Are you going to tell me what you're doing, or keep pretending those pages need to be sorted for the 10th time? Elliot didn't look at him, busy putting the baton away in its black velvet case. Stephen stood, adjusting his thin-framed glasses, just wondering. When was the last time you smiled during a rehearsal? I smile when there's a reason to smile. The orchestra played perfectly just now. The orchestra played correctly. There's a difference. Stephen walked up to the podium, hands in the pockets of his faded jeans. He was the opposite of Elliot in nearly every way. From the messy clothes to the relaxed gait. Even music to him was about feeling, not control. You know the new violinist arrives in 3 days for her audition, right? Elliot frowned. And I heard she's interesting. Interesting how? Interesting in a way that'll probably make you lose your patience in under 5 minutes. Wonderful. Elliot grabbed his leather briefcase and started descending the podium. Nothing like starting the week knowing I'll be dealing with yet another misunderstood genius who thinks playing with emotion makes up for lack of technique. Who said she lacks technique? Elliot stopped and turned to face him. If it were only technique, you'd have said competent or adequate. You said interesting. Interesting means trouble. Stephen laughed. That easy laugh that used to annoy Elliot, but that he secretly appreciated for being one of the few spontaneous things in his routine. Have you ever considered that trouble might be exactly what this orchestra needs? Nui? Liar. Elliot didn't respond. He left the hall with firm steps, the sound of his shoes echoing off the wooden floor, leaving Stephen behind with a knowing smile on his lips. Elliot's apartment was in the heart of Toronto, an Art Deco building that had seen better days but still held a melancholic charm. He liked it for that very reason, the way the old architecture refused to surrender to the aggressive modernity surrounding it. Inside, everything was in order. Books organized by composer on the mahogany shelves, vinyl records aligned with military precision, a worn leather armchair by the window, where he'd sit with a glass of red wine and stare at the city without really seeing it. The framed photo on the side table was the only thing out of place in that controlled environment. Natalie smiled in the picture, blonde hair falling over her shoulders, green eyes full of life. She wore that blue dress he loved, the one he bought for her in Paris. Elliot picked up the photo, his fingers tracing the outline of her face through the glass. 4 years. 4 years since that night in Milan, since the performance that was supposed to be the pinnacle of their careers, and ended up the end of everything. He could still hear the ambulance, still smell the antiseptic hospital air, still see the doctor approaching with that look that says everything before a word is spoken. Brain aneurysm. Fast, painless, they assured him. As if that made any difference. He put the photo back, grabbed the wine bottle, and poured himself a glass without ceremony. The dark liquid swirled in the glass, catching the soft light of the lamp. Natalie would have laughed at him now, said he was becoming a caricature of himself, a bitter maestro who forgot why he made music in the first place. She was always the emotional side of the equation, playing piano like she was having an intimate conversation with the keys, while he conducted like he was solving mathematical theorems. Together, they were balance. Alone, he was just control. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from Sophia, his assistant, reminding him of the Roy Thompson board meeting the next morning. He typed a short, blunt reply, then tossed the phone onto the couch. Outside, the city blinked with premature Christmas lights. November had barely begun, but Toronto already looked like a giant shop window. Elliot hated this time of year. All that forced cheer, all that artificial joy people wore like a mask to hide the same loneliness he carried. Only they wouldn't admit it. He finished the wine in one gulp and headed to bed. When sleep finally came, it brought the same dreams as always. Natalie on stage, the orchestra playing, her collapsing, him running, never getting there in time. The next morning started like every other. Black coffee, cold shower, dark gray suit, navy blue tie. Elliot didn't believe in superstition, but he did believe in routine. Routine kept the chaos of the world outside. Roy Thompson Hall looked different in daylight, less majestic, more functional. The fluorescent lights exposed every scratch on the floor, every stain on the red curtains that had looked so elegant under the stage lights the night before. Sophia was already waiting by his office door, tablet in hand, wearing her usual air of efficiency. She was 28, but carried herself with the seriousness of someone 2 decades older. Brown hair and a flawless bun, black tailored suit, high heels that clicked decisively on the floor. "Good morning, Maestro. The board wants to discuss the spring season programming and has a few concerns about my approach with the musicians," Elliot finished, entering his office and tossing his briefcase on the desk. "I know. They complained again that I'm too harsh, too demanding, too whatever excuse they need for their mediocrity." Sophia closed the door behind her. "Actually, they want to talk numbers. Ticket sales dropped 7% last season. That made him pause. 7%? The reviews are excellent as always, but the audience is saying the performances are technically flawless, but what?" Sophia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Cold. The word that shows up the most in the feedback is cold." Elliot laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "So they want me to turn my orchestra into a circus? Add pyrotechnics? Have the musicians play backwards or juggle their instruments? They want you to let the musicians breathe, to play not just with precision, but with soul. Soul doesn't pay the bills, Sophia. Excellence does. Excellence without an audience doesn't pay the bills either." He stared at her, and for a moment she thought she'd gone too far. But Elliot just sighed and sank into the leather chair behind the desk. "What are they suggesting?" They want you to give the new violinist a chance. No excessive pressure in the first few weeks. Let her adapt, show openness to different approaches. Different approaches, he repeated, tasting the words like they were sour. That's code for musical anarchy. It's code for giving someone a chance who might bring something new, something the audience wants to feel. Elliot got up and walked over to the window, watching the movement on the street below. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, with no idea that perfection demanded sacrifice. That discipline was the only thing separating art from chaos. When does she arrive? Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Name? Sophia checked her tablet. Bonnie Sheldon, 29 years old. Graduated from Juilliard, played with smaller orchestras over the past 5 years, but has an impressive record of solo performances and? She was dismissed from 2 orchestras for creative differences with musical direction. Elliot turned, one eyebrow raised. Creative differences. Translation, she doesn't know how to follow instructions. Or maybe the instructions weren't worth following. He returned to his desk, picked up the Mont Blanc pen Natalie had given him 10 years ago, and twirled it between his fingers. Are you on their side now? Sophia smiled. That small, knowing smile she reserved for moments when she knew she was right. I'm on your side, Maestro. I always have been. But sometimes being on your side means saying what you don't want to hear. He gave a slight nod, dismissing her. Sophia left silently, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the pen that wouldn't stop spinning in his fingers. A difficult violinist, exactly what he didn't need. But maybe, whispered a treacherous voice in the back of his mind, exactly what he deserved. The rest of the day passed in tedious meetings and budget discussions that Elliot endured with the patience of someone mentally elsewhere. When he finally returned home, the snow had started falling again, covering Toronto in a white blanket that made the city look almost peaceful. He had dinner alone, as always, garlic and oil pasta, a simple recipe Natalie used to make on nights they were too tired to cook anything fancy. He never learned to make anything else, so it was either that or takeout. After dinner, Elliot did something he hadn't done in months. He went to the bedroom closet, pulled a cardboard box from the back, and took out Natalie's violin. The instrument gleamed even in the dim light, the varnished wood reflecting years of care and love. She had inherited that Stradivarius from her grandmother, and treated it like an extension of herself. Elliot ran his fingers over the strings, and the soft sound that emerged seemed to echo not just in the room, but deep within him, in a place he'd locked away 4 years ago and sworn never to open again. You would have liked her, he said softly, speaking to the ghost of his wife, this rebellious violinist arriving tomorrow. You would have laughed and told me to take it easy, to give her a chance. You were always better at that than I was. The violin didn't answer, of course. Violins don't speak, but Elliot could have sworn he felt something, a momentary warmth in the air, as if Natalie were there, looking at him with that knowing smile that said she understood exactly what he was thinking. He put the instrument back in its case, closed the closet, and went to bed. Tomorrow would be just another day, another rehearsal, another battle for perfection in a world that seemed less and less interested in it. But as sleep took him, Elliot couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was about to change, that the carefully constructed silence surrounding him was about to be broken, and that maybe he wouldn't have the strength to stop it. Morning arrived under a gray sky that promised more snow. Elliot woke at 6, as always, and followed his routine with the precision of a Swiss watch. Black coffee, cold shower, navy blue suit this time, black tie. He looked in the mirror as he adjusted the knot and saw what he always saw. A man in control. A man who left no room for surprises, except today for some inexplicable reason. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his car keys. Annoying. The drive to Roy Thompson Hall was silent. Elliot never turned on the radio, never listened to music in the car. There was already too much music in his head, scores unrolling in his mind like endless rolls of paper. This time, though, his focus was divided. He caught himself thinking about the so-called rebellious violinist he was about to meet. Bonnie Sheldon. The name sounded young, too casual. He could already picture it. Another musician full of revolutionary ideas about how classical music needed to be modernized, as if centuries of tradition were something to be tossed out like old clothes. By the time he parked, the snow had started to fall again, fine and steady. Elliot entered the building and immediately sensed something different. There was a charge in the air, a kind of quiet buzz that made the musicians already arriving for rehearsal exchange, furtive glances and whispered comments. Stephen appeared in the hallway, coffee cup in hand, wearing that irritating smile of someone who knows something you don't. "Good morning, Elliot. Sleep well? What's going on?" "Our new addition arrived early." "Very early. She's been in the rehearsal room for an hour, playing." Elliot frowned. "Alone?" "Completely alone. And man, you need to hear this." Before Elliot could respond, the sound reached them. A violin. But not just any violin playing any piece. It was Tchaikovsky, the D major concerto. And whoever was playing wasn't just performing the notes. She was living every one of them. The music flowed down the hallway like water, at times soft and melancholic, then erupting into cascades of pure emotion. There was passion in it, but also technique. Incredible technique, in fact. The trills were crystal clear, the transitions between positions flawless, the intonation perfect. Elliot walked toward the rehearsal room as if pulled by an invisible thread. Stephen followed at a safe distance, clearly enjoying the moment. The door was ajar. Elliot stopped at the threshold and, for the first time in 4 years, forgot to breathe. She stood with her back to the door, completely immersed in the music. She wore dark jeans and a burgundy knit sweater that slid slightly off one shoulder. Her hair was a controlled mess of brown curls tied in a loose bun, with strands falling and swaying as she moved. She played barefoot, her feet tapping rhythm against the cold floor, her whole body moving with the music, as if she and the violin were one and the same. But it was her face that held Elliot's attention. Eyes closed, lips parted, an expression of such intense concentration it bordered on ecstasy. She wasn't playing for anyone. She was playing for herself, or maybe for something greater, something Elliot had forgotten even existed. She finished the movement with a long, sustained note that seemed to float in the air for several seconds before dissolving into silence. Then she opened her eyes and turned, as if she had known all along that he was standing there, and Elliot saw her face for the first time. Bonnie wasn't conventionally beautiful. She was captivating. Honey-colored eyes that looked like they could see straight through a person. Angular features with high cheekbones. A wide mouth always ready to smile or challenge. She had the kind of face cameras loved, full of contrast, of stories waiting to be told. "You must be the famous Maestro," she said, and her voice was husky like she'd just woken up, or just finished screaming. "The Tyrant of Toronto," Elliot blinked, snapping out of his trance. "Maestro Holden, and you must be the troublesome violinist." "Bonnie," she said, offering a hand, still holding the bow in the other. "And I prefer the term artist with strong opinions." He didn't shake her hand. He just stared at her, this barefoot, tousled creature who had the audacity to play Tchaikovsky, as if she'd composed it herself. "You're late," he said, though it was an obvious lie. "I'm actually an hour early, but that's okay, I get it. Bosses like to assert dominance right away. It's a Wolfpack thing, right? Joe, who's in charge?" Stephen coughed to hide a laugh. Elliot shot him a glare before turning his attention back to Bonnie. "You know why you were dismissed from your last 2 orchestras?" "I do. Because I disagreed when the maestro was wrong. Maestros are not wrong. So you've never been wrong in your life? Wow, what an honor to meet perfection in person." She placed the violin back in its case with a care that contrasted with her bold demeanor. "Look, Maestro Holden, I came here because Roy Thompson Hall has an incredible reputation. But if you're looking for a musician who just follows orders like a robot, hire a playback track. It's cheaper and won't argue with you." Elliot stepped into the room and suddenly the space felt smaller. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and had that kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. But Bonnie didn't move. She lifted her chin and met his gaze with an intensity that was almost physical. "You have technique," he admitted, and it cost him more than he expected. But technique without discipline is just pretty noise. And I don't lead an orchestra of pretty noise. And I don't play in orchestras that confuse discipline with fear. Your musicians are good, Maestro, but they're playing scared, not striving to get it right, afraid of getting it wrong. There's a huge difference. How do you know how my musicians play? Because I watched the videos from last season. Technically flawless, emotionally dead. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Stephen decided it was time to step in before someone got murdered. "How about we start over?" he said, walking into the room with his usual peacemaker energy. "I'm Stephen, pianist for the orchestra and sole keeper of sanity around here." "Bonnie, welcome." "Elliot, breathe before your head explodes." Elliot ignored him, eyes still locked on Bonnie. "Rehearsal starts in 15 minutes. I expect you to be ready to perform the pieces I sent by email. I've memorized them all. All of them. All of them. Including the variations in the second movement of Brahms you marked as optional. They weren't optional, they were a test. And I passed." She slipped on her shoes, a worn pair of black sneakers that had clearly seen better days, picked up her violin case, and walked past him toward the door. But she paused at the threshold, turning with a smile that was pure challenge. "Oh, and just for the record, Maestro, I'm not afraid of you. So tuck that little hope away for good." And with that, she left, leaving behind a trail of soft perfume and a tension so thick Stephen let out a low whistle. "Dude, you just dug your own social grave." Elliot finally tore his gaze from the empty doorway. "She's a walking earthquake. She's incredible. And you know it. What I know is that she's going to turn my orchestra upside down." "Good," Stephen said, giving him a light pat on the shoulder. "Because honestly, Elliot, your orchestra needs shaking up. And so do you." Elliot didn't answer. He left the room and went to his office, closing the door behind him with more force than intended. He sat at his desk, fingers tapping the dark wood, his mind spinning in circles. She was right. About the musicians playing with fear. About the performances being technically perfect but emotionally hollow. About everything, damn it. And he hated when people were right, especially when those people were barefoot. Defiant violinists who played Tchaikovsky like they were making love to the notes. Sophia knocked and entered without waiting for a response. She knew him well enough to recognize when formalities were pointless. "So, did you meet our new member?" "I did. And? And she's going to be a problem." Sophia smiled, that small knowing smile of hers. "The best ones always are, Maestro." She left before he could reply, leaving Elliot alone with his thoughts and a strange feeling in his chest. Something between irritation and something else he couldn't quite name, or maybe didn't want to. The 15 minutes passed far too quickly. When Elliot stepped into the main rehearsal room, the orchestra was already assembled. 43 musicians, all in their places, all watching him with that familiar mix of respect and unease he had carefully cultivated over the years. And there she was, sitting in the second chair of the first violins because June still held the first. Bonnie adjusted her violin with calm, confident movements, looking completely at ease, as if she'd been part of the group for years. June, on the other hand, was watching her with a look that mixed curiosity and territorial threat. She was an excellent violinist, technically precise, always impeccable. But she lacked something, that fire Bonnie had shown earlier, and June knew it, and hated knowing it. Elliot stepped up onto the podium, picked up the baton, and waited. Silence settled like always, heavy, expectant. Brahms. Symphony No. 1. We'll start from the first movement. I want precision, clarity. I want every note to sound exactly as Brahms imagined when he wrote it. He raised the baton, and the orchestra readied themselves. But before he could give the first cue, Bonnie raised her hand. She raised her hand, like she was in a classroom. Elliot lowered the baton slowly. Yes, just a quick question. How exactly do you know how Brahms imagined it? Did you talk to him personally, or is that just your assumption? A murmur rippled through the orchestra. Someone choked. Stephen hid his face behind his score, shoulders shaking with restrained laughter. Elliot stepped off the podium, walked directly to the violin section, stopped right in front of Bonnie, close enough to see the golden flecks in her honey-colored eyes, close enough to catch her perfume, laced with the smell of strong coffee. The score exists for a reason. The dynamics, the tempo markings, the expressions, they're all there. It's not an assumption. It's an instruction. But music isn't math. Two people can read the same score and play it in completely different ways, and both can be right. Not in my orchestra. Then maybe the problem is the orchestra, she said. Just low enough that only he could hear. Or maybe it's you. Their eyes met, and for a moment the entire world seemed to shrink down to the narrow space between them. Elliot could hear his own breath, could feel the heat radiating from her, even across the small gap. And then he did something that surprised everyone, himself included. Play it solo. Show me how you think Brahms should sound. Bonnie blinked, clearly not expecting that. Seriously? Completely. 24 bars from the first movement. Solo, now. She stood, positioned her violin, and began to play. And it was devastating. She began softly, almost tentatively, like testing the waters. But then the music began to swell, to take shape, to transform into something alive. She wasn't just playing notes, she was telling a story, painting emotions in the air, making everyone in the room feel something deep and unnamed. It was Brahms, yes, but Brahms filtered through her soul, her experience, her pain and joy. It wasn't perfect. There were moments where transitions weren't seamless, little hesitations here and there, but it was real. And when she finished, the silence that followed wasn't the usual kind. It was a silence filled with awe, with reverence. Elliot realized he'd forgotten to breathe, again. He returned to the podium, his legs just slightly less steady than he'd prefer. Interesting was all he could manage. And the word came out rougher than he meant. Bonnie sat down, a faint flush on her cheeks but her eyes shining with defiance and triumph. So, Maestro? Still think it's just pretty noise? He didn't answer. He simply lifted the baton again, from the top. Everyone together, and this time, he paused, his eyes locking with hers for just a heartbeat. I want you to feel what you're playing. Don't just perform, feel it. The orchestra exchanged confused glances. Stephen grinned openly. June looked stunned, and Bonnie? Bonnie simply nodded, as if to say finally, the music began again. And this time it was different. Still had the precision Elliot demanded, but now there was something else. A breath, a life, a soul that hadn't been there before. When they finished the movement, Elliot lowered the baton and looked at his musicians. They looked different, more relaxed. Happier, maybe. Better, he said. And that was as close to a compliment as anyone was ever going to get from him. Much better. 15-minute break. Then we'll move on to the second movement. The musicians stood, chatting animatedly with each other. Bonnie put away her violin and headed for the hallway, probably in search of coffee or fresh air. Elliot stepped off the podium and went straight to his office. Closed the door, loosened his tie, sank heavily into his chair. What the hell had just happened? He had spent 4 years building walls around himself, crafting an unbending routine, turning music into something safe, controllable, predictable. And in a single morning, that barefoot, impossible woman had started to tear down every one of those defenses. And the worst part? The part that truly scared him? He wasn't sure he wanted her to stop. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was June, entering uninvited as she always did when she wanted to complain about something. We need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. About her. The newcomer. You can't seriously be considering making her first violin. I didn't say I was going to do that. But you will. I saw the way you looked at her. How you let her play a solo. You've never done that for me. Elliot sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. June, you're an excellent musician. You always have been. But I don't have what she has. I know, June said, arms crossed, jaw tight. I just don't understand what's so special about her. She makes people feel something, Elliot said. And it was the most honest thing he'd said all day. And that's rare. June left without another word, but Elliot could feel the tension she left behind. Another problem to deal with. Another complication in a life that was becoming dangerously complicated. The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur of notes and corrections. Bonnie kept challenging him in small ways, suggesting changes, questioning choices. And to Elliot's horror and fascination, some of her suggestions were good. Very good, in fact. When the rehearsal ended and everyone began packing up their instruments, Elliot found himself watching her again. Bonnie was talking to Stephen, laughing at something he'd said, completely at ease. And Elliot felt something strange. Something he hadn't felt in so long it took him a moment to recognize it. Envy. Envy of how she lived so lightly, so freely, so connected to the music and the people around her. Envy of how she didn't carry the weight of a past that crushed her with every breath. He grabbed his briefcase and left before she could catch him staring. But as he drove home through the now heavy snowfall, Elliot couldn't get Bonnie out of his mind. The sound of her violin, the fire in her eyes, the way she had said, "I'm not afraid of you." And he realized, with a mix of dread and something dangerously close to hope, that maybe she wasn't the one who should be afraid. Maybe it was him. 2 weeks had passed since Bonnie's arrival, and Roy Thompson Hall had turned into an elegant battlefield, where every rehearsal was a fresh skirmish between two stubborn generals. Every morning, Elliot woke up telling himself that today would be the day he finally put that untamable violinist in her place. And every night, he came home with the uncomfortable feeling that it was he who had lost ground. It was a cold Tuesday when things truly began to shift. The snow piled up on Toronto's streets created that muffled quiet that made the city seem like it was holding its breath. Elliot arrived at the theater with his usual black coffee in hand and found Sophia already waiting for him, wearing the expression he had come to recognize as trouble ahead. "Good morning, Maestro. And before you ask, yes, June filed a formal complaint to the board about the solo assignments." Elliot removed his coat, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "She's complaining about Bonnie again?" "Technically, she's complaining about you. Says you've been favoring the new member unfairly, and that it's hurting the orchestra's morale. The orchestra's morale is better than it's been in the last 2 years. Ticket sales are up 12% since the season started." "I know that." "You know that. But June doesn't care about numbers. She wants to know why she's lost 3 solos to the newcomer. In less than a month." Elliot hung his coat and loosened his tie. That small gesture Sophia knew meant he was about to dig in his heels. "Because Bonnie plays better. It's that simple. Maybe to you. To June, it's a declaration of war." Sophia wasn't wrong. Over the past few days, the tension between the two violinists had become so obvious. Even the most distracted musicians noticed it. June had started making pointed remarks during breaks, questioning Bonnie's interpretations out loud, and committing petty sabotages, like rearranging her sheet music or occupying her space in the warm-up room. Bonnie, to her credit, responded with a cheerful indifference that only irritated June more. It was like watching a cat trying to provoke a butterfly that just kept fluttering by, utterly unbothered. That day's rehearsal was set for 9 a.m. Elliot entered the room right on time and found the orchestra already in place. But there was an odd charge in the air. Small clusters of musicians were murmuring, casting sideways glances toward the first violins. Bonnie sat in her chair, calmly tuning her instrument with the focused ease she always carried before playing. She wore an oversized gray sweater that slid off one shoulder and fitted black pants. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, loose strands framing her face, June. Beside her sat rigid as a marble statue, eyes fixed on the score in front of her. Elliot stepped up to the podium and tapped his baton against the stand, calling for attention. "Brahms, third movement, from bar 20 to the end. Pay close attention to the dynamics. There's a tendency to rush the transition into the fortissimo." The music began, and for the first few minutes everything ran smoothly. But then came the violin solo, the delicate passage where first and second violins exchange intricate harmonies, and June deliberately sped up the tempo. Bonnie adjusted instantly, trying to follow, but the mismatch was obvious. The rest of the orchestra hesitated, unsure which of the two to follow. Elliot brought the baton down sharply. "Stop. June, you're half a beat ahead of the orchestra. I'm following your cue." "Maestro," June said, her tone polite but her eyes full of challenge. "My cue was clear. You chose to ignore it. Maybe I interpreted it differently. I thought we were encouraging personal interpretations now." The venom in her voice was subtle, but everyone heard it. Stephen, over at the piano, grimaced. This was going to get ugly. Elliot stepped off the podium slowly, too slowly, and when he moved with that kind of deliberate pace, everyone knew a storm was coming. Personal interpretation does not mean sabotage. If you have a problem with me, or with any decision I've made, you bring it to me privately. You do not use rehearsal as a platform for personal tantrums." The silence that followed was suffocating. June flushed but kept her chin high. "I'm not throwing a tantrum. I'm simply asking if quality standards still matter, or if it's just about who's the current favorite." Bonnie, who had stayed quiet until now, set her violin on her lap and turned to June. "You know, June, if you spent half the energy you use trying to sabotage me on actually improving your interpretation, maybe you wouldn't have to worry so much about who's getting the solos. I don't need advice from someone who's been kicked out of 2 orchestras for not knowing how to work as a team. I was kicked out for not accepting mediocre conductors. And yet here I am, so clearly that's not the issue." June stood, her face now fully red. "You're an arrogant little thing who thinks she can come in here and change everything, just because you've got some kind of natural talent. But talent without discipline is worthless, and discipline without soul is useless." Bonnie shot back, rising to her feet. Despite being a few inches shorter, her presence seemed to fill the space. "You play like you're following a recipe, June. Technically perfect, emotionally empty, and everyone here knows it. Enough." Elliot's voice cracked through the room like thunder. He rarely raised his voice, which made the moment all the more powerful. Both women turned to him, stunned. "You two, my office now. Everyone else, 20-minute break." He left the room without another word. June followed immediately, back straight, steps furious. Bonnie took a moment longer, exchanging a glance with Stephen, who merely shrugged with a look that said, "You brought this on yourself." In his office, Elliot waited until both were inside, then shut the door with a decisive click. He remained standing behind his desk, hands braced on the dark surface, staring at them with an expression that could freeze lava. "You're going to settle this now, or I'll settle it for you, and I guarantee you won't like my solution." June was the first to speak. "With all due respect, Maestro, I think the issue is clear. Since she arrived, you've given her special treatment. Solos, placement, even the way you conduct rehearsals has changed. And that's not fair to those of us who've been here for years building this orchestra." "Special treatment?" Elliot repeated, voice dangerously low. "I gave the solos to the one with the best interpretation. If that feels like favoritism, maybe the issue isn't my choice, but your performance. It hit like a slap." June's face stiffened. "I've been in this orchestra for 5 years. 5 years of dedication, of following every instruction, of playing exactly as you asked. And now you're telling me I'm not good enough? I'm telling you that being technically adequate isn't enough anymore." Elliot straightened, crossing his arms. "The world has changed, June. The audience has changed. They don't want just precision, they want to feel something. And you're not giving them that, because you never asked for that." June's voice cracked with frustration. "For years you drilled into us that what mattered was following the score, respecting the composer, maintaining discipline. And now suddenly none of that matters?" She wasn't wrong, and Elliot knew it. He had built this orchestra in his own image, rigid, exacting. And now he was asking them to change, because he was being forced to change. And the person forcing that change stood silently beside June, arms crossed, watching with those honey-colored eyes that seemed to see through every one of his defenses. "Things evolve," he said at last. "I evolve. And I expect my orchestra to evolve with me. If you can't do that, maybe it's time to consider other options." It was brutal, and he saw the impact of his words on June's face. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but she quickly pulled herself together, lifting her chin in one final gesture of dignity. "I understand perfectly, Maestro." "Excuse me?" She left, closing the door with exaggerated care, the kind that's louder than a slam. Bonnie exhaled the breath she'd been holding. "That was intense." "That was necessary," Elliot replied, turning toward her. And suddenly the office felt smaller, more intimate. "But you also need to learn how to work as part of a team. You can't keep provoking other musicians just because you disagree with something." "I didn't provoke," I responded. "There's a difference. One that only matters if your goal is to be right, or if you actually want the orchestra to work." Bonnie took a step toward the desk, her eyes gleaming with that now dangerously familiar mix of challenge and amusement. You know what your problem is, Maestro? You want me to change to fit your mold. But it was exactly because I don't fit any mold that you gave me all those solos. You can't have both. I can have talented musicians who also know when to shut up. And what? Have an orchestra full of obedient robots who will never question anything? Is that really what you want to go back to? He paused, realizing he wasn't even sure what he wanted. I want peace. I want to run a rehearsal without feeling like I'm mediating a war. Then maybe you should stop treating music like war, she said softly, and start treating it for what it is. A conversation, a dialogue, something alive that needs space to breathe. She was too close now. Elliot could smell her perfume. He could see the tiny freckles on the tip of her nose, could count the different shades of gold and brown in her eyes. And he realized, with a jolt that was almost physical, that he wanted to touch her. He wanted to run his fingers through those messy curls, wanted to know if her skin was as soft as it looked, wanted to see if she'd still be so defiant if he kissed that sarcasm right off her lips. He took a step back, as if he'd been shocked. Go back to rehearsal, and try not to start another war today. Bonnie watched him for a long moment, and Elliot had the uncomfortable feeling that she knew exactly what had just gone through his mind. But she simply nodded and walked out, leaving him alone with a heart pounding faster than it should, and a sense of danger that had nothing to do with orchestra drama. The days that followed were tense. June requested a transfer to the second violin section, claiming she preferred less responsibility. It was a public defeat and everyone knew it, but she accepted it with a quiet dignity that made Elliot feel unexpectedly guilty. Bonnie officially took the first chair, and the orchestra reacted with a mix of relief and apprehension. She was good, no one could deny that, but she was also unpredictable, and that made some musicians nervous. Elliot found himself watching her more than he should during rehearsals. The way she bit her lower lip when she was focused, the way she gently swayed during the more emotional parts, the way her eyes lit up when the orchestra finally nailed a difficult passage. He started noticing small things. The fact that she always arrived 20 minutes early and spent the time playing alone, that she took her coffee with 2 sugars and a bit of milk, that she had a habit of slipping off her shoes during long rehearsals and playing in socks, which was entirely inappropriate, yet somehow adorable. Adorable. When had he started using that word? It was a late Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the confrontation with June, when everything changed again. The rehearsal had been particularly exhausting. They were working on a new Mahler piece that required absolute precision and considerable physical stamina. By the time Elliot dismissed the orchestra, it was past 7 p.m. Most of the musicians left quickly, eager to return home and resume their lives outside those walls. But Bonnie remained, packing up her violin with the same meticulous care she always showed her instrument. Elliot was gathering his sheet music when he heard her voice. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up. She stood in front of the podium, hands in the pockets of a navy blue wool coat, her hair loose in waves around her shoulders. Depends on the question. Why do you really do this? Conducting, all the pressure, all the responsibility. You could easily be a solo musician, make more money, have fewer headaches. But you chose to stay here, dealing with 43 different personalities every day. Why? No one had ever asked him that before. Not like that. Not with that kind of genuine curiosity, without judgment. Elliot stepped down from the podium slowly, holding the sheet music in his hands. Because alone, you're just one voice. But with an orchestra, you can create something greater than any one person could alone. It's about... He searched for the right words. It's about turning many voices into one story. Bonnie tilted her head, considering. That's beautiful. Surprisingly poetic for someone so obsessed with technique. I'm not obsessed with technique. I'm obsessed with excellence. There's a difference. Is there? Because sometimes it seems like you use technique as an excuse not to feel anything. And there it was again. That infuriating ability she had to cut straight to the point. To expose truths he preferred to keep buried. You don't know anything about me, he said. But even to his own ears, the defense sounded weak. I know you lost someone important, and that since then, you've been hiding behind your baton like it can protect you from feeling everything all over again. Elliot felt the air leave his lungs. Who told you? No one had to. It's in your eyes every time the orchestra plays something sad. It's in the way you pull away every time someone gets too close. It's in the music you won't let them play. He should have been furious. Should have put her in her place. Told her she had crossed a line. But all he could do was grip the sheet music tighter and say quietly, "My wife. She died 4 years ago. Brain aneurysm. During a performance in Milan. Bonnie didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She just nodded, acknowledging the pain without trying to fix it. Was she a musician too? Pianist. The best I've ever known. And you think if you don't feel, if you just focus on technique and perfection, it won't hurt as much? I know it doesn't work like that. But it's better than the alternative, which is letting it in, letting it hurt, letting it destroy me." Bonnie stepped a little closer, and Elliot realized they were alone in the enormous hall, the low lights casting long shadows around them. "But you're already destroyed, Elliot. You're just destroyed on the inside where no one can see. And that's not better. It's just lonelier." It was the first time she called him by his name. Not Maestro, not Holden, just Elliot. And the sound of it, her husky voice wrapping around his name, did something strange to his chest. "I survive the only way I know how. Surviving isn't living. It's enough." Is it? They stared at each other in the heavy silence of the empty room, and Elliot realized it wasn't. It had been for 4 years. But now, with her standing in front of him, challenging him, provoking him, making him feel things he was sure he'd never feel again, surviving felt like far too small a wager. But he didn't say any of that. He just grabbed his coat and stepped away. "It's late. You should go home." Bonnie watched him for a moment longer, then picked up her violin case. "One day you're going to have to stop running, Elliot." "I'm not running." "Yes, you are. From me, from yourself, from everything you feel when you actually play real music." "But it's okay," she said, with a smile that was half challenge, half promise. "I can wait." And she left, leaving Elliot alone in the empty theater, his heart pounding out of rhythm and the unmistakable feeling that the walls he'd so carefully built over the past 4 years were beginning to crack, and maybe he no longer wanted to fix them. January arrived with a blizzard that blanketed Toronto in pure white. The streets looked like postcard scenes, and Roy Thompson Hall took on that magical air only the Canadian winter can create, with ice-forming crystals on the windows and people's breath rising in clouds in the less heated rooms. 2 months had passed since Bonnie's arrival, and Elliot had to admit, if only to himself, that the orchestra had never sounded better. The numbers didn't lie. Ticket sales were up 20%. The reviews were enthusiastic. And even the most skeptical musicians had started to accept that maybe change wasn't such a terrible thing. But the price of that transformation was taking its toll on Elliot. He slept less, thought too much, and found himself at odd moments during the day, drifting into places he'd sworn never to revisit. And all of those places somehow had the face of a violinist with wild curls and honey-colored eyes. It was a Friday night when things really started to unravel. The orchestra had just wrapped another exhausting rehearsal, preparing for the February gala concert that would attract critics from all over North America. Elliot was in his office reviewing the final notations on the score when he heard voices in the hallway. One of them was Bonnie's. The other was male, unfamiliar, laced with an accent he couldn't quite place. Against all common sense, Elliot stood and went to the door, opening it just enough to see the hallway. Bonnie stood near the back exit talking to a tall man with dark hair and an easy smile. He wore an expensive leather coat and had that confident air of someone used to getting what he wanted. And what he clearly wanted was Bonnie's attention. "So what do you say? Dinner? Italian food, red wine, conversations about anything but music?" The man smiled, leaning slightly toward her. Bonnie laughed, but it was polite, lacking the spontaneity Elliot had come to recognize as genuine. "Franklin, we've talked about this. I just don't think it's a good idea." "Why? Because we broke up 3 years ago?" "People grow, Bonnie. I've grown. And yeah, I was a jerk back then, but now I'm here, in Toronto, with a new job, a new outlook. And the one thing that hasn't changed is, I still think about you." Elliot felt something unpleasant twist in his gut. Jealousy. That's what it was. And he hated admitting it because he had no right to feel jealous of an employee, of someone who was supposed to be there just to play music, nothing more, except she hadn't been just that in a long time. Franklin, Bonnie sighed, adjusting the strap of her violin case on her shoulder. I wish you all the success in the world, I really do. But what we had is over, and it ended for good reasons. One reason. I was selfish and put my career ahead of our relationship. But now I see what I lost. Give me a chance to make it right. There was a moment of hesitation, and Elliot realized he was holding his breath. Then Bonnie shook her head, gentle but firm. No, Franklin. I'm sorry. But no. The man looked genuinely disappointed, but nodded in understanding. All right, I get it. But if you change your mind, you've got my number. He leaned in and kissed her cheek before walking out the back door, leaving behind a trail of melting snow and expensive cologne in the air. Bonnie stood there for a moment, shoulders tense before turning and nearly colliding with Elliot, who had stepped out of his office without even realizing it. Ah, you scared me, she said, placing a hand over her heart, clearly startled. Were you standing there this whole time? I was leaving, Elliot lied. Didn't want to interrupt. You weren't interrupting anything. Just my ex being... My ex, he seemed persistent. Franklin's always been that way. It used to be part of his charm. Now it's just annoying. Elliot knew he should return to his office, grab his things, and go home. But instead he heard himself say, Have you had dinner yet? Bonnie blinked, surprised. What? Dinner, food, have you eaten or not yet? No. Not yet, why? Why indeed? Elliot had no idea what possessed him to make the invitation. He only knew that the thought of her going home alone, maybe reconsidering the offer of that charming ex, was unbearable. There's a Thai place 3 blocks from here. Decent food, quiet atmosphere. We can go over the changes to the gala program while we eat. It was the weakest excuse he'd ever made for anything, and from the slow smile that spread across Bonnie's face, she knew it. Sure, Maestro. Let's talk about the program. The restaurant was small and cozy, with warm yellow lights and the mouth-watering scent of spices and curry. They got a table in the corner, away from the fogged-up windows in the busy entrance. Elliot ordered pad thai and green tea. Bonnie ordered red curry and a Thai beer he'd never heard of. When the food arrived, they ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that could have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. So, Bonnie finally broke the silence, twirling noodles on her fork. Are we going to pretend we're actually here to talk about work? Or can we skip to the part where you admit you only invited me because you saw Franklin and got curious? Elliot nearly choked on his tea. I wasn't curious. You were. You had that face. The same face you make when someone plays off-key in the middle of a solo. I don't have a specific face for that. Yes, you do. The left corner of your mouth tightens and your brow creases slightly. It's subtle, but once you know what to look for, it's impossible to miss. Elliot didn't know whether to be impressed or alarmed by how closely she watched him. He opted to change the subject. How long were you two together? 3 years. Met him at Juilliard. He was a cellist, very talented, very ambitious. At first it was good. We got each other, shared the same passion for music. But then he landed a spot with an orchestra in Boston, and suddenly his career was the only one that mattered. And yours? Mine became secondary. There was always an excuse, an important performance, an audition he couldn't miss. And little by little I realized I was always bending my life to fit into his. Never once did the same for me. Elliot pushed around his pad thai, suddenly not very hungry. So you ended it? I did. He was shocked, like it had never crossed his mind that I might have boundaries. Then he tried to convince me I was being dramatic, that all relationships require sacrifice. And technically, he wasn't wrong, but sacrifice is different from erasing yourself. You never thought about going back? Bonnie looked at him over the rim of her beer, those honey-colored eyes reflecting the restaurant's low light. No, because I learned that some things, once broken, don't go back to the way they were. And that's okay. Sometimes breaking is necessary to rebuild something better. There was an extra layer in her words, a meaning that went beyond the story about her ex. Elliot felt like she was speaking directly to his own wounds, to the parts of him that had been broken for 4 years and that he'd refused to rebuild. "And you?" Bonnie asked, sliding her empty plate to the side. "Your wife. Do you want to talk about her?" "There's not much to say. She died, I survived. End of story." "That's not a story. That's a declarative sentence avoiding any real emotion." Elliot let out a dry laugh. "You have an impressive talent for turning simple conversations into therapy sessions. And you have an impressive talent for avoiding any conversation that makes you feel something real." She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. Somehow that was worse, because Elliot had no defense against honesty. He fell silent for a long moment, turning his teacup slowly between his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more vulnerable than he intended. "Natalie was everything I'm not. Spontaneous, joyful, able to see beauty in places where I only saw chaos. She played piano like she was having an intimate conversation with the instrument. And I conducted like I was solving math problems. And together you were balance." "Exactly. She taught me to feel. I taught her to structure. It worked. It worked so well that I never considered the possibility that one day she wouldn't be there anymore." Bonnie said nothing, just waited. And in that silence, Elliot found himself saying things he'd never told anyone, not even Stephen. It was during a performance. Milan Philharmonic. She was playing the Rachmaninoff Concerto. I was conducting. In the middle of the second movement, she stopped. Just stopped playing, hands resting on the keys, her eyes distant. I thought she'd lost her place in the score, which was odd because she had a photographic memory. And then she collapsed. His voice broke at the end and he had to take a sip of tea to go on. It took 16 minutes for the ambulance to arrive. 12 minutes where all I could do was hold her and beg her to keep breathing. At the hospital, they said it was a brain aneurysm. Fast, painless. As if that made any difference. As if there's any kind of pain that makes losing the person you love easier to bear. Bonnie reached across the table and touched his hand. It was a simple touch, just her fingers on his. But Elliot felt as though a jolt of electricity had surged through him. "I'm so sorry, Elliot. Truly. I spent the last 4 years trying not to feel, because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant reliving that night over and over again. So I buried myself in the music, but only the technical part. The structure, the rules. Because rules don't make you feel, they just exist. But you're not a rule, you're a person. And people need to feel, even when it hurts. What if I don't know how anymore? You do. You're just afraid to try." Elliot looked at her hand still resting over his. Slim, calloused fingers from years of violin playing. Short nails, no polish. A hand that created music, gave life to notes on a page. And right now, was offering something he wasn't sure he deserved. Connection. Understanding. The possibility that maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. He turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. It was the most intimate thing he had done in 4 years. And for a moment he felt a surge of panic, the urge to pull away, to retreat to the safety of solitude. But Bonnie gently squeezed his hand, and the panic eased. "It doesn't have to be perfect, Elliot. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to try." They stayed like that longer than was strictly appropriate, hands intertwined, across a Thai restaurant table while the snow continued to fall outside and the world carried on around. Then when they finally stepped out, the cold cut like a blade, but Elliot barely noticed. He insisted on calling a cab for her, even though Bonnie said she lived nearby and could walk. "It's too cold. And too late, please," she accepted, while they waited under the restaurant awning, their breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. She turned to face him. "Elliot," she said softly, "thank you for trusting me enough to talk about her. Thank you for not letting me keep running." The cab pulled up, headlights slicing through the snowy haze. Bonnie took a step toward it, then turned back at the last second and kissed his cheek. It was quick, chaste, almost nothing. And yet Elliot felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "Good night, Maestro," she said, that teasing smile back on her lips. "See you Monday." "Good night, Bonnie." He watched the cab disappear into the snowy night, his hand still holding the place where she had kissed him, his heart beating in a way it hadn't in years. And for the first time since Natalie died, Elliot allowed himself to feel something other than pain. He allowed himself to feel hope. Small, terrifying, but undeniably real. By the following Monday, something had changed. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Elliot caught himself smiling more during rehearsals. Not wide smiles, just subtle lifts at the corners of his mouth, when Bonnie made a cheeky remark, or when the orchestra nailed a particularly tricky passage. Stephen noticed immediately. "Of course, you're different," he said during a break, as he brewed coffee in the musicians' lounge. "I'm the same as I've always been." "Liar, you're almost..." "Happy, can I say happy? Is that word allowed in your presence?" Elliot rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "You're impossible. I'm observant. And what I observe is that since last Friday, you've been less of a grump." "What happened Friday? Did you finally try meditating? Start taking vitamins? Meet someone?" "I didn't meet anyone." But something happened. Elliot didn't answer. He simply picked up his coffee and walked back to the rehearsal room. But Stephen followed him with a knowing smile on his face. That week's rehearsals were intense, preparing for the gala concert just 3 weeks away. It would be the most important performance of the season, with high-profile critics, orchestra patrons, and even representatives from other cultural institutions in attendance. The pressure was high, but somehow the orchestra thrived on it. Bonnie led the first violins with a natural confidence that inspired the rest of the musicians. Even June, now in the second section, seemed to have found her place, playing with more ease and less tension. It was a Wednesday afternoon. During a particularly productive rehearsal, when the accident happened, they were working on a complex Beethoven passage when Bonnie, turning quickly to check the sheet music, bumped into the stand. It toppled, throwing her off balance. She tried to steady herself, but her foot slipped on the freshly waxed floor, and before anyone could react, she fell, her violin slipping from her hands and hitting the ground with a horrible sound. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elliot stepped down from the podium in 3 long strides, reaching her side before the rest of the orchestra could even process what had happened. "Are you okay? Did you hurt anything? Your hand, your wrist?" Bonnie sat on the floor, her face pale but not from pain. She was staring at the violin, which had landed a few feet away. One of its strings visibly snapped. "The violin," she whispered, her voice so brittle it didn't even sound like her. He helped her up, quickly checking for injuries. Just a few scrapes on her elbow, nothing serious. But when she walked over to the instrument and picked it up with trembling hands, Elliot saw tears forming in her eyes. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice choking. "She left it to me when she died. It's the only thing I have of her." The broken string wasn't the only problem. There was a small but visible crack along the side of the instrument. Repairable, certainly, but still a wound to something irreplaceable. Elliot felt a quiet, simmering anger rise in his chest, at himself. He should have noticed the floor was slippery, should have asked for it to be dried better, should have protected his musicians better, should have protected her. "Stephen," he turned to the pianist, "call off the rest of the rehearsal. Everyone can go home." The orchestra dispersed quickly, several musicians stopping to check if Bonnie was okay. She nodded and offered them a strained smile. But Elliot could see she was on the verge of falling apart. When they were finally alone, he gently took the violin from her hands. "There's an excellent luthier here in Toronto, Viktor Petrov. He specializes in restoring old instruments. I'll take it to him right now and I'll ask him to make it top priority. That's going to cost a fortune. I'll cover it. Elliot, you don't have to." "I do. This happened in my theater, under my watch. And besides..." He paused, realizing he was about to admit something that mattered. "I want to. Let me do this for you." Bonnie looked at him for a long moment, eyes still glassy with unshed tears. Then she nodded, and he saw the exact second she gave up trying to stay strong. "Okay," she whispered. Elliot led her to his office, sat her down in the leather armchair, and called the luthier immediately. Victor, who had worked with him before, promised to examine the violin that very night and provide a full assessment by morning. While Elliot made the arrangements, Bonnie sat in silence, arms wrapped around herself, staring off into nothing. When he hung up the phone, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry. I'm being dramatic. It's just an instrument." "It's not just an instrument. It's a connection to someone you loved. I understand that better than you think." She lifted her gaze to him, and in that moment they shared something quiet and deep, the understanding that both of them carried losses, that both had things that couldn't be replaced, only remembered and honored. Elliot pulled up the other chair and sat next to her, not across from her, but beside her. Simple gesture that said they were in this together. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said softly, and Bonnie did. She told him about the woman who raised her after her parents died in a car crash, about how her grandmother, a retired violinist, had been her teacher, her mother, her best friend, about how every note she played carried the memory of that incredible woman who had turned tragedy into music. Elliot listened, and for the first time in 4 years, he didn't try to run from someone else's emotion. He let himself be present. He let himself feel her pain. He let himself be the support she needed in that moment. When Bonnie finally settled, she looked at him with a tear-streaked smile. "Thank you. For not telling me it's going to be okay or that it's just an object. For just being here. Always," he said, and realized he meant it. "Whenever you need me." And in that quiet office, while snow continued to fall outside and the world kept turning, something essential shifted between them. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a confession. It was something deeper. It was trust. It was shared vulnerability. It was the foundation on which something real could be built. And for the first time in a very long while, Elliot wasn't afraid of that. February arrived with the gala concert that had consumed every waking moment of the past 2 months. Roy Thompson Hall had been sold out for weeks, and the pressure on Elliot and the orchestra was immense. Critics from New York, Boston, and Chicago had confirmed their attendance. There were even rumors that representatives from the Vienna Philharmonic would be in the audience, assessing the orchestra for a potential European tour. Bonnie's violin had returned from the luthier 3 days after the accident, restored so masterfully that it was impossible to tell where the crack had been. Victor had worked 48 straight hours to ensure the instrument was flawless in time for the concert. Elliot paid the bill without hesitation, and when Bonnie tried to protest, he simply said it was an investment in the orchestra. But they both knew it wasn't just that. In the weeks following the accident, something had shifted between them. It wasn't obvious. No grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It showed in the little moments. Elliot showing up with coffee on particularly cold mornings. Bonnie waiting for him to finish reviewing scores so they could walk to the parking lot together. Conversations that started with music and ended with everything and nothing. Stephen noticed it all with that irritating smile of someone who knows exactly what's going on, but has the decency not to comment, at least not directly. "So," he said casually during a break while Elliot was reviewing the final markings for the concert, "you and Bonnie are getting pretty close. She's my concert master. It's natural that we work closely. Working closely is one thing, but you two have that thing, looking at each other when you think no one's watching. It's cute, and completely obvious to anyone with functioning eyes." Elliot didn't look up from the score. "You're seeing things that don't exist. I'm seeing things you're trying to pretend don't exist. There's a difference. Even if there were something, which there isn't, it would be completely inappropriate. She's my employee. She's an adult independent musician who plays in the orchestra you conduct. It's not like you're her corporate boss. And besides, Elliot," Stephen finally set down his coffee and looked at him seriously, "have you considered that maybe you deserve to be happy again? I'm not unhappy. You weren't unhappy. But you weren't alive either. You were just functioning. And now, for the first time in 4 years, you actually seem to be here, present, living. And that has everything to do with her." Elliot closed the score with more force than he intended. "The concert is in 3 days. I'd rather focus on that than on your unsolicited analysis of my personal life. I'm just saying, Natalie would have been happy. She never wanted you to bare yourself with her. It was a low blow and Stephen knew it. But it was also true, and they both knew that too. Natalie had been light and life, and the thought of Elliot spending the rest of his days in emotional exile would have broken her heart." Elliot didn't respond. He just gathered his things and walked out, leaving Stephen alone with his coffee and his inconvenient truths. The night of the concert arrived with a mix of light snow and electric anticipation. Roy Thompson Hall was transformed, decorated with understated elegance, the lighting casting an air of importance and sophistication. The lobby buzzed with Toronto's cultural elite, long dresses and tuxedos, lively conversations and flutes of champagne. Backstage, the atmosphere was entirely different. Nervous energy, musicians checking and rechecking their instruments. The tense kind of silence that always precedes great moments. Elliot was in his dressing room, adjusting his tie for the 5th time when Sophia knocked on the door. 5 minutes, Maestro. The audience is full, and yes, the Vienna reps are in the front row. Right-hand side. Great, no added pressure then. Sophia smiled. That small smile she used when she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. What? Elliot asked, grabbing his baton. Bonnie's backstage. She looks nervous, more than usual. Maybe you should talk to her before you go on. Elliot hesitated. Talk to her now, minutes before the most important concert of the season, when he could barely organize his own thoughts. But the idea of her being nervous, possibly scared, was worse than any personal discomfort. Tell her I want to see her. Here, now. Sophia nodded and left. A minute later, Bonnie knocked on the door and stepped inside. She was stunning. A long black dress, simple but elegant. Her hair swept up in a sophisticated bun that left her neck completely exposed. A single piece of jewelry, a fine silver necklace. And in her eyes, that mix of determination and fear that Elliot recognized because he saw the same thing in the mirror. Sophia said you wanted to see me, she said. Lingering at the doorway, hands clasped in front of her. Come in. Close the door. She obeyed, and suddenly the dressing room felt much smaller. Elliot could smell her perfume, something floral and subtle, perfectly suited to the occasion. How are you feeling? Terrified, she admitted with a nervous laugh. Is that normal? Playing in front of international critics should be normal by now. But I feel like it's my first performance all over again. It's completely normal. I still get nervous before every big concert. You, the man who stares down entire orchestras with the same expression he'd use to order coffee? I just hide it better, but the nerves are there. They always are. Bonnie took a few steps toward him, and Elliot could tell she was genuinely shaken. This wasn't just pre-performance anxiety. It was something deeper. What if I mess it up? What if my hand shakes during the solo? Or I lose the tempo, or Bonnie, he cut in, stepping toward her until they were just inches apart. Look at me. She did, those honey-colored eyes meeting his, raw vulnerability written in every line of her face. You are the best violinist I've ever worked with. Not technically, though your technique is flawless. But because you play with your soul, you make people feel, and that's what the audience needs tonight. Not mathematical perfection, truth. And you have that in abundance when you, what if it's not enough? It will be. I know it the same way I know the sun will rise tomorrow. You were made for this stage, Bonnie. And tonight you're going to prove that to every single person out there. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with something that looked like gratitude, and something else Elliot couldn't quite name. How do you always know exactly what to say? I don't, I'm usually terrible with words. But with you, he paused, realizing he was on the verge of admitting something dangerous. With you, it's different. The air between them shifted. It grew heavier, charged with something electric that made Elliot's heart race. He was so close he could see the golden flecks in her eyes, count every freckle on the bridge of her nose, feel the warmth radiating off her skin without even touching her. And for the first time in 4 years, Elliot wanted to kiss someone, not out of despair, trying to forget, but with the hope of remembering what it felt like to be alive. But before he could do anything foolish and wonderful, there was a knock on the door. 2 minutes. Sophia's voice from the other side, the moment shattered. Bonnie stepped back, a blush rising on her cheeks, her eyes still locked on his. I have to go. Bonnie. She stopped at the door, turning back. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in me. Always. She left, and Elliot remained there, heart pounding like he'd just run a marathon, mind spinning with questions he had no answers for. But there was no time to process. The concert was about to begin. When Elliot stepped onto the podium and the curtain rose, the audience erupted in polite applause. He looked at the orchestra, 43 people who had become part of his life. part of his journey back into the land of the living, and then his eyes found Bonnie's. Seated in the first chair of the violins, her instrument positioned perfectly. Her gaze locked on him with an intensity that made something tighten in his chest. She gave a small nod, barely perceptible. A tiny gesture that said, "I'm ready." Elliot raised his baton. Silence fell like a heavy cloak over the theater. And then with a smooth, precise motion, he gave the downbeat. The music surged like a wave, Brahms in all his complex emotional glory. The orchestra responded with a precision born of months of hard work, but also with a passion that was new, vibrant, alive. And Bonnie. Bonnie played as if she were speaking to God. Every note was crystal clear. Every musical phrase told a story. Every movement of her bow painted emotion in the air. She wasn't just executing the score. She was living every second of it. Elliot conducted like he never had before, not with the rigid control he'd maintained for years, but with a fluidity that allowed the music to breathe, to grow, to become something greater than the sum of its parts. When Bonnie's solo came in the second movement, the entire theater seemed to hold its breath. She began softly, almost timidly, building tension with each sustained note. And then, like a bird taking flight, the music burst into a cascade of pure emotion. Joy, pain, hope, fear, it was all there. Every human feeling distilled into vibrating strings that pierced hearts like arrows. Elliot watched her, his baton nearly forgotten in his hand, completely hypnotized. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying with the music, utterly surrendered to the moment. And he realized he was witnessing something rare. Not just talent, but true art. The ability to turn air and vibration into something that touches the human soul. When she finished the solo, there were tears on some of the faces in the audience. Elliot could see them glistening in the dim light. And he felt something warm on his own face, realizing with a jolt that they were his own tears. He hadn't cried since Natalie's funeral. He had sworn never to let music touch him that way again. But here he was, in the middle of the most important concert of the season, with silent tears running down his face, because one rebellious, incorrigible violinist had managed to break through the final wall around his heart. The rest of the concert passed in a blur of music and emotion. When the final note was played and Elliot lowered his baton, the silence that followed was absolute. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, no one moved. And then the audience exploded. Deafening applause. People rising to their feet. Cries of "Bravo!" echoing off the theater walls. Elliot turned to the orchestra, gesturing for everyone to stand. They obeyed, and the applause grew even louder. But when he extended a hand toward Bonnie, motioning for her to step forward and receive the recognition she deserved, something magical happened. She didn't just step forward. She looked at him with those eyes shining with tears and emotion, and smiled. Not the teasing smile she usually wore, but a genuine, vulnerable smile that said everything words never could. The applause went on for a full 5 minutes. 3 curtain calls, critics scribbling furiously. The Vienna representatives speaking animatedly among themselves, nodding in approval. Backstage, when the curtains finally closed, chaos erupted. Musicians hugging, laughing, crying with relief and joy. Sophia appeared with a bottle of champagne, handing out glasses to everyone. Elliot accepted one mechanically, but his eyes searched for just one person, and found her in the corner of the room, surrounded by fellow musicians eager to congratulate her. Their eyes met across the crowd, and in that moment, with all the noise and celebration around them, Elliot made a decision. He crossed the room, weaving through people with polite but firm determination, until he reached her. Bonnie looked at him, surprised, still holding her violin. "Elliot, I need to talk to you. Now, in private." There was urgency in his voice that made the other musicians instinctively step back. Stephen appeared out of nowhere, gently taking the violin from Bonnie's hands. "I'll hold this for you. Go. Clearly the maestro has something important to say." Bonnie let Elliot guide her through the backstage, corridors, ones she barely recognized, until they reached his dressing room. He opened the door, waited for her to step inside, and closed it behind them. Silence, total in stark contrast to the chaos outside. Elliot, what? But he didn't let her finish. Because suddenly all the words, all the logic, all the caution that had governed his life for the past 4 years simply evaporated. He took 2 steps toward her and stopped, so close he could feel her breath on his face. You were incredible tonight. No more than that. You were transcendent. And when you played that solo, when you poured your entire soul into those notes, I realized something. What? Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. That I've spent 4 years pretending I didn't need to feel anything. That I didn't want to feel anything. But you made me remember that feeling. Even when it hurts is the only way to truly be alive. Bonnie stood completely still, her eyes wide, chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Elliot, let me finish, please, because if I don't say this now, I'll lose the nerve. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of vulnerability. You defied my baton on your first day, challenged every decision I made, turned my orchestra upside down and made me question everything I thought I knew about music and about myself. And I tried to resist, tried to pretend you were just another musician, just someone passing through my life. But I can't anymore. I don't want to anymore. What are you saying? Elliot took the final step between them, raising a hand and touching her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. I'm saying you broke down all my defenses. I'm saying that for the first time in 4 years, I wake up in the morning and there's something besides emptiness. I'm saying that when you play, I don't just hear music. I hear possibility, future, hope. A single tear slipped down Bonnie's cheek, but she was smiling. You know what this means, right? All that talk about professionalism and appropriate distance gone. So be it. I care more about you than I do about my own stupid rules. Elliot Holden admitting he's wrong. I need to mark this date on the calendar. He laughed, a sound so genuine, so full of life, that Bonnie felt her heart melt. You've always been untamable, and you've always been too stubborn for your own good. Then I guess we're even. Seems fair. They stayed like that for a moment, so close they could feel each other's warmth, eyes locked. The entire world reduced to that tiny space between 2 bodies. 2 souls who had fought this for far too long. Can I kiss you? Elliot asked, his voice husky, thick with emotion he didn't even try to hide. I thought you'd never ask. And then, finally, gloriously, he kissed her. It was like waking from a 4-year dream. Like breathing for the first time after being underwater too long. Like hearing music after endless silence. The kiss began gently, almost tentatively, 2 explorers navigating uncharted territory. But then something ignited. That chemistry that had been simmering for months finally released. Elliot's hands found her waist, pulling her closer. Bonnie's arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his graying hair. The kiss deepened, grew in intensity, becoming a wordless conversation where everything that hadn't been said in the past months finally found expression. There was desire in it, yes, but also relief, gratitude, and promise. The taste of champagne on her lips, the scent of lavender mingled with something uniquely Bonnie. The feeling of finally being in the right place. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, eyes shining, lips flushed. That was, Bonnie began. But the words didn't come. Necessary, Elliot finished. Inevitable. And long overdue. I couldn't agree more. He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, just feeling. Feeling her there, real and solid and perfectly imperfect. Feeling his own heart beating in a rhythm it hadn't known in years. Feeling hope, what do we do now? Bonnie whispered. Now, Elliot opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. Now we go back out there, celebrate with the orchestra, deal with the critics and the Vienna reps. And then if you want, we have dinner. A real dinner. Not just an excuse to talk about work. A date? A date. The perfect maestro is asking me out on a date. I need witnesses for this. I was never perfect, just too arrogant to admit my flaws. He kissed her forehead softly. But you make me want to be better. Not perfect, just real. Real, I can work with that. They fixed themselves up as best they could. Smoothing wrinkled clothes and tousled hair. Trying and failing. Not to look like something monumental had just happened in that dressing room. When they opened the door and returned to the celebration, Stephen spotted them immediately. The grin that spread across his face was pure satisfaction. Well, settle all your urgent administrative matters? Elliot shot him a glare but couldn't hide the smile. You're impossible, and you're happy, finally. The rest of the night passed in a blur of congratulations, conversations with enthusiastic critics, and the announcement that yes, the Vienna Philharmonic wanted to discuss a possible European tour for the following year. But through it all, Elliot and Bonnie exchanged glances. Quiet, secret smiles, accidental touches that lingered half a second too long. The silent promise that when the night finally ended, when everyone had gone and the theater stood empty at last, they would have time. Time to explore what had begun. Time to discover how two broken people might somehow help fix each other. Time to finally live instead of merely survive. The morning after the concert arrived with a cruel brightness that made Elliot question whether any of it had been real or just an adrenaline and champagne-induced hallucination. He woke with the sun shining directly into his eyes, a faint pounding in his head, and the memory of the kiss burning hotter than any hangover could explain. He had kissed Bonnie. Not a polite kiss, but one that had wiped out 4 years of caution in a matter of seconds. And worse, he'd liked it. He'd felt things he had sworn never to feel again. He'd lowered defenses he had built brick by brick through years of carefully curated solitude. And now, in the cold light of morning, panic began to creep in. Elliot took a cold shower, colder than usual, as if he could wash away the confusion of the night before. He dressed with his usual meticulous care, each piece of clothing another layer of armor against the world, and against his own treacherous feelings. The phone buzzed on the table. A message from Bonnie. Good morning. About yesterday. Can we talk? 3 dots appeared and vanished several times, as if she were typing and deleting entire messages. Finally, nothing else came. Elliot stared at the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. What would he say? That it had been a mistake? That the emotion of the concert had clouded his judgment? That in a moment of weakness he had forgotten all the reasons why this was a terrible idea? But that would be a lie, and he had never been good at lying. He locked the phone without responding and left the house. Roy Thompson Hall was quiet on Sunday morning. Most of the musicians were off, taking time to rest after the intensity of the previous night. But Elliot needed the silence, the comforting familiarity of the empty theater where he could think without the weight of curious eyes. He walked into his office and found a pile of emails from enthusiastic critics, glowing praise about the performance, and 3 messages from the Vienna representatives wanting to schedule a meeting to discuss details of the European tour. Success. This was what he had always wanted. Recognition, excellence, validation that his work mattered. So why did he feel so empty? The door opened without a knock. Bonnie walked in, wearing jeans and an oversized gray sweater, her hair loose and still damp as if she'd just stepped out of the shower. She wore no makeup, and there were dark circles under her eyes that showed she had slept as little as he had. You didn't answer my message, she said. Closing the door, I didn't know what to say. How about the truth? Elliot stood, placing the desk between them like a physical barrier that somehow made sense to his confused. When the truth is complicated, try. Anyway, he ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she already knew so well. Yesterday was intense, the concert, the emotion, everything. And I said things, did things I maybe shouldn't have said or done. Bonnie crossed her arms, her jaw tight. So you're saying it was a mistake? I'm saying I don't know what it was. I only know it's complicated. You work for me. We have a professional relationship that's finally functioning. And mixing that with whatever it was that happened yesterday. What happened yesterday was you finally being honest. For the first time since I met you, you let your guard down and let someone in. And now, in the light of day, you're scared and trying to backtrack. I'm not scared. Yes, you are. You're terrified, because feeling something real means risking losing it again. And you decided a long time ago it's easier to feel nothing than to take that risk. The precision with which she dismantled his defenses was both impressive and infuriating. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I do, because I did the same thing for 3 years after I broke up with Franklin. I built walls, kept everyone at a distance, convinced myself it was safer to be alone. And then I met you, and somehow you managed to break through every single one of those defenses. And it was terrifying. But you know what's worse than being scared? Letting fear win. Elliot braced his hands on the desk, his head bowed, every muscle in his body tense. I don't know if I can do this, Bonnie. I don't know if I can open that space again. Let someone in like that. Because when I lost Natalie, when she died in my arms on that stage in Milan, something in me broke. And I've spent 4 years trying to put the pieces back together, but they never quite fit again. And now you come along and make everything seem possible again. But what if it's not? What if I let you in and then… He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't say out loud the fear that woke him at 3 a.m., sweaty and trembling. What if he lost her too? Bonnie walked around the desk and stood in front of him. So close Elliot could feel the warmth of her body, smell the shampoo in her damp hair. Elliot, look at me, he obeyed. And what he saw in her eyes was pure understanding. No judgment. No pressure. I'm not going to promise you nothing bad will happen. I can't. Nobody can. Life is unpredictable and scary and sometimes cruel. But if you spend the rest of your life protecting yourself from the possibility of pain, you're also protecting yourself from the possibility of joy. And that's not living. That's just existing. Existing is safer, but is it worth it? The question hung in the air between them, and Elliot had no answer. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to admit it. I need time, he said finally, to process all this, to figure out what I want. Bonnie nodded, and there was sadness in her eyes, but also understanding. All right, I can give you time. But Elliot, don't take too long, because life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just happens, whether we're ready or not. She left the office, and the silence she left behind was heavier than any sound. The following weeks were an elegant torture of denial and unspoken desire. Elliot and Bonnie kept working together, because they had no choice. Rehearsals for the European tour had begun, and every moment together was a painful reminder of what had happened that night after the concert. But they were professionals. Or at least they tried to be. Elliot grew increasingly demanding during rehearsals, as if he could compensate for his emotional confusion with absolute control over the music. He corrected every tiny mistake, demanded endless repetitions, pushed the orchestra beyond its limits, and Bonnie responded with a polite coldness that was worse than any direct confrontation. She executed every instruction perfectly, questioned nothing, didn't provoke as she once had. It was as if the spark that had defined their relationship from the start had been snuffed out, the orchestra noticed. How could they not? The tension between the maestro and his concertmaster was so obvious that even the most distracted musicians felt its weight in the air. Stephen, naturally, was the first to confront Elliot about it. What the hell happened between you two? He asked one Thursday afternoon, after a particularly tense rehearsal where Elliot had made Bonnie repeat the same passage 17 times. Nothing happened. Lie. Something definitely happened. You went from looking at each other like lovesick teenagers to barely being able to stand in the same room. And it's affecting the orchestra. The orchestra is fine. The orchestra is walking on eggshells, trying not to trigger the next explosion from the grumpy conductor who's back at full force. Whatever you did, fix it now. I didn't do anything. Exactly. That's the problem. Stephen left before Elliot could answer, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable truth that his friend was right. It was a Friday night, almost a month after the gala concert, when everything shifted again. Elliot was working late in his office, reviewing the final tweaks to the tour schedule, when he heard music coming from the main rehearsal room. Violin, playing something he didn't immediately recognize, but carrying a melancholy so deep it tightened his chest. He walked toward the room and found her, Bonnie. She was playing with her eyes closed, utterly lost in the music. It wasn't a concert piece. It felt personal, perhaps an improvisation, notes flowing like tears. Elliot stood in the doorway, unable to move, incapable of doing anything but listen, and understand that this music was more than music. It was everything she had not said these past weeks. It was frustration and sorrow and anger and desperate hope, all distilled into vibrating strings. When she finally stopped and opened her eyes, she found him there, frozen like a statue, his face betraying emotions he usually kept well hidden. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "Long enough." Bonnie set the violin on her lap, her fingers tracing the instrument's outline as if seeking comfort in something familiar. "That music, did your grandmother compose it?" Elliot entered the room, keeping his distance but not leaving as part of him wanted to do. "No, I composed it. Or I'm composing it. I don't really know yet. I only know that sometimes words aren't enough, so I play. It's beautiful. Sad but beautiful. It reflects how I feel, so that makes sense." The silence that followed was heavy with all that hadn't been spoken. Elliot knew he should leave, maintain the distance he'd so carefully set. But his feet didn't obey, and instead of walking out, he found himself closing the space between them. "Bonnie, No, let me speak first," she interrupted, rising and setting the violin aside with care. "I've spent the past weeks trying to give you space, trying to respect what you said about needing time. But Elliot, I can't pretend it's all okay anymore. It isn't. And I can't keep playing this push and pull, wanting and being afraid. I know. I don't want it either. Then stop. Stop fighting it. Stop being so afraid to feel." Elliot took another step, now only an arm's length away. He could see the freckles on her nose, the redness around her eyes from recent crying, the raw vulnerability she no longer tried to hide. "I'm scared," he admitted, and the honesty cost him more than he expected. "I'm terrified, because you became important too quickly, and the idea of losing you. You won't lose me. I'm here, right here, trying to show you it's worth the risk. What if I hurt you? What if I don't know how to do this, how to be with someone again? Then we figure it out together. Nobody expects perfection, Elliot. I certainly don't. I want honesty. I want you." Something inside him broke, or perhaps finally mended. It was hard to tell. But suddenly all the reasons this was a bad idea seemed insignificant compared to the single reason it might be the only right one. He was tired of being afraid, tired of protecting himself, tired of surviving when he could be living. Elliot closed the last of the distance, his hands coming to her face, his thumbs brushing the damp tracks of tears he hadn't seen fall. "I want to try," he said. "I want this. I want you. It's terrifying, and I'll probably mess up a lot. But I want to try." The smile that lit her face was like the sun rising after an endless night. "That's the first really smart thing you've said in weeks. I have my moments. Rare, but memorable," he laughed. She laughed. Then he kissed her, not with the desperate urgency of their first kiss, but with something deeper: promise, commitment, a conscious decision to stop running and start fighting for something real. They parted eventually, breaths tangled, foreheads pressed together, foolish smiles on their faces. "So," Bonnie said, fingers toying with his shirt collar, "what do we do now?" "Now I take you to dinner. Proper dinner. An official date from the perfectionist Maestro? From the imperfect Maestro who's trying to be better. That one I'll accept." They left the theater together, hands intertwined, and for the first time in weeks, Elliot felt he could breathe again, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But as they walked through the cold March night, something at the edge of his vision caught his attention. A figure standing across the street watching. When he looked directly, the person stepped back and melted into the shadows. Probably nothing, just someone waiting for a bus. Yet a strange shiver ran down his spine, a premonition he couldn't name. He squeezed Bonnie's hand a little tighter, and she looked at him with a silent question in her eyes. "You okay?" "Yes," he answered, dismissing the feeling. "I'm fine." But as they continued, Elliot couldn't help glancing over his shoulder once more. The street was empty, but the sensation lingered. Like the past he had tried so desperately to bury was about to return, and when it did, it would bring secrets that could change everything. May arrived carrying with it the promise of the European tour, and a subtle yet undeniable shift in the dynamic between Elliot and Bonnie. They hadn't made any public announcements. There were no formal declarations or overt displays, but the orchestra knew. People always know when two people become something more. Stephen made sly comments. June observed them with a mix of resignation and curiosity. Sophia smiled with that air of someone who'd known all along it would happen. And the music somehow became even better, as if the connection between conductor and concertmaster had created a frequency the rest of the orchestra could feel and respond to. The last 2 months had been a revelation for Elliot. He had forgotten what it felt like to wake up with something to look forward to, beyond rehearsals and responsibilities. What it was to talk for hours about nothing important. To laugh, truly laugh. Not polite smiles, but full, chest-deep laughter. Bonnie challenged him constantly, never letting him slip back into old patterns. When he got too serious, she cracked a joke. When he tried to control everything, she reminded him to breathe. And when the nightmares came, because they still did sometimes, she simply held him and waited for the storm to pass. But London was approaching. The concert at Royal Albert Hall would be the tour's pinnacle, the performance that would define not just the orchestra's reputation, but Elliot's future as a conductor. And as the date neared, a familiar tension began to settle in. It was a Wednesday night. 2 weeks before the trip, when the first crack appeared, Elliot was at Bonnie's apartment, a small but cozy space in Kensington Market, filled with plants, books, and that kind of organized chaos that made him simultaneously uncomfortable and utterly charmed. They had eaten takeout Thai food and were now on the couch, Bonnie with her legs draped over his lap reading emails on her phone. The Vienna reps confirmed they'll be in London, she said casually. And apparently they're bringing the artistic director of the Philharmonic. No pressure, right? Elliot was absent-mindedly massaging her feet, but his mind was somewhere else. In Milan, at the last major international concert he'd done, before everything fell apart. Elliot? Bonnie's voice pulled him back. Are you here? Sorry, I was just thinking. About. He hesitated. They'd talked about so much over the past few months, but there were corners of his memory he still avoided. Dark corners best left locked. The last time I was on a stage like that. In Milan. The night Natalie died. Yes, you've never told me the details. Just that she had an aneurysm during the performance. Elliot looked at his hands, as if he might still see blood that had long since been washed away. It was during Rachmaninoff. She was the soloist. I was conducting. Everything was perfect. The orchestra, the acoustics, the energy in the audience. It was the kind of night you wait your whole life for. And then, midway through the second movement, she stopped. His voice dropped, roughened by memory. She just stopped playing. Her hands were on the keys, completely still. For 2 seconds, I thought she'd lost her place, which was impossible. Natalie never lost her place. Then I saw her face. The confusion, the fear, and then she collapsed. Bonnie reached out and laced her fingers with his. I stopped the orchestra, jumped off the podium, got to her before anyone else moved. She was conscious, but she didn't recognize me. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Then so slowly she said my name, once, and closed her eyes. A single tear ran down his cheek, the first time he'd cried while speaking about that night. The ambulance took 16 minutes to arrive. 16 minutes where all I could do was hold her and beg her to keep breathing. At the hospital, they said there was nothing they could do. The aneurysm was massive. She died 3 hours later. Bonnie said nothing. She simply moved closer and wrapped her arms around him, letting him fall apart against her. Years of pent-up grief finally finding release. When he finally calmed, she pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. And you carry guilt, don't you? For not realizing something was wrong. For not saving her, I should have noticed. She'd been complaining about headaches for weeks. I said it was stress. Told her she was worrying too much. If I had just pushed her to see a doctor. Elliot, no. You can't do this to yourself. Brain aneurysms don't give clear signs. Doctors can't predict them. There was no way for you to know. But I should have. I was her husband. I should have known something was wrong. You're human. And humans aren't omniscient. You didn't have X-ray vision to see inside her skull and find a ticking time bomb the best specialists couldn't detect. He knew she was right. Rationally, he knew. But guilt isn't rational. Guilt is the thing that lives in your chest and eats you from the inside out, whispering that you could have done something, should have done something. London is the same kind of stage, the same kind of pressure, and I'm scared, he admitted, voice cracking. I'm scared I'll step onto that podium and relive it all. That I'll look at you and see her falling. That I won't be able to tell the past from the present." Bonnie took his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Look at me. I'm not her. I'm different. The situation is different. What happened to Natalie was a terrible tragedy. But it's not going to happen again. You can't live in fear that every happy moment will be ripped away. That's not living, I know. But knowing and feeling, those are two different things. Then feel it, with me. Feel the fear, but don't let it win. We'll go to London together. You'll conduct. I'll play. We'll give an unforgettable performance. And then, we'll come home together. Simple as that. Nothing simple, no, but we can try to make it feel that way." They stayed like that for a long time, curled together on her couch, wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. But the next morning, when Elliot woke alone in his own apartment, the anxiety had returned in full force. He tried to shake it with his usual routine, strong coffee and an ice-cold shower, but the feeling clung to him, like something was about to go wrong. He arrived at the theater earlier than usual and found a letter on his desk, a white envelope, no return address. Just his name, written in a neat handwriting he didn't recognize. With slightly trembling hands, he opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 4 typed lines. "You think you know the truth about that night in Milan, but you don't. Someone was there who saw everything. Someone who knows what really happened. London will be revealing. Be careful what you wish to uncover." Elliot read and reread the letter 3 times, his heartbeat pounding out of rhythm. What did it mean? Who had sent it? And more importantly, what was there to uncover about that night that he didn't already know? He picked up his phone, almost called the police, but stopped himself. What would he say? That he'd received a cryptic letter? One that made no specific threats, only suggested there were secrets about his wife's death? He would be considered insane, or paranoid, or both. He locked the letter in a drawer and tried to focus on the rehearsal that would begin in an hour. But the unease lingered, an itch under the skin he couldn't quite reach. When Bonnie arrived, she immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked as soon as they were alone. "Nothing. Just pre-tour nerves." I've seen your pre-tour nerves. This is something else." Elliot hesitated, then showed her the letter. Bonnie read it with growing concern. "This is bizarre, and slightly threatening. You should go to the police." "And say what?" "There's no direct threat, just vague insinuations." "Vague insinuations about your wife's death?" "Elliot, that's not normal." "I know, but maybe it's just someone trying to rattle me before the concert, spiteful critic, or someone jealous of the orchestra's success. Or maybe it's someone who actually knows something." The possibility hung between them, heavy and unsettling. "There was nothing to know," Elliot said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was an aneurysm, a medical accident, a tragedy. End of story. Then why would someone suggest otherwise?" That was the question Elliot didn't want to face. Because if there was more to the story, if there was something he didn't know about that night, then the last 4 years of his life had been built on ignorance, and he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover the truth. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of grueling rehearsals and mounting anxiety. Elliot didn't receive any more letters, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, checking shadows, seeing threats where there probably were none. Bonnie remained his anchor. She didn't push when he didn't want to talk, didn't judge when he had bad days. She was simply there. A constant presence he hadn't known he needed until he had it. And finally, the day of the trip to London arrived. The flight was long and turbulent, a perfect reflection of Elliot's state of mind. The orchestra occupied nearly an entire section of the plane, musicians chatting excitedly about the tour, their excitement palpable in the air. But Elliot could hardly focus on anything beyond the letter. The words that kept echoing in his mind, "You think you know the truth, but you don't." London greeted them with a fine drizzle and a gray sky that seemed to foreshadow drama. The Royal Albert Hall was even more impressive than Elliot remembered. A Victorian testament to grandeur and tradition, the kind of place where legends were made and destroyed. The concert was scheduled for Friday night. They had 2 days for rehearsals and to adjust to the hall's different acoustics. Elliot managed preparations with his usual efficiency, but everyone could feel the tension radiating from him. On Thursday night, when most of the orchestra had gone out to explore the city, Elliot remained alone on the empty stage. Just him, the baton, and the ghosts of past performances. "I knew I'd find you here." Bonnie's voice echoed through the vacant hall. She walked up to him wearing jeans and a dark green wool coat, her hair loose over her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Neither could I. So I thought I'd come check on you." She stepped up onto the podium and stood beside him, both of them staring into the vastness of the hall, that tomorrow would be packed with critics, patrons, and important figures. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. "I don't know. I mean, musically, yes. The orchestra is flawless, you're incredible, the program is solid. But in here," he touched his chest, "in here it's still chaos." "Because of the letter?" "Because of everything. The letter, the memories, the fear that something's going to go wrong. I know it's irrational, but I can't shut my mind off." Bonnie took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "Then don't shut it off. Let your mind do what it needs to do. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, but don't let it control you. And remember that no matter what happens tomorrow, you're not alone." "I'm here. Steven's here. The whole orchestra is here. We're a team, and teams look out for each other." Elliot looked at her. This extraordinary woman who had stormed into his life and somehow rearranged every piece of him into something that made sense again. "I love you," he said, the words spilling out before he could think them, before he could question or suppress them. Bonnie's eyes widened, startled. "What? I love you." "I didn't plan to say it like this here in this moment, but it's true. You brought me back to life when I was convinced all I could do was survive. You reminded me that music isn't just technique, it's emotion. And you're the best thing that's happened to me in 4 very long years." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her smile was pure sunlight. "I love you too. Ever since that first day when you were a complete jerk to me, and I decided I was going to make you admit I was right." He laughed, that genuine sound she had learned how to draw out of him. "You're pure provocation, and I'm addicted to it, and you're stubborn. But we're perfect like this." They kissed there on the empty stage, beneath the dim lights of the Royal Albert Hall, 2 wounded musicians who had found healing in each other, and for a moment all the fears and anxieties dissolved, leaving only the simple truth of 2 people who had chosen to risk pain for the possibility of joy. The night of the concert arrived with an intensity that felt almost physical. The Royal Albert Hall was packed, every seat taken, the anticipation in the air so dense it could be cut with a knife. Critics from across Europe, representatives from prestigious orchestras, arts patrons, all had come to judge whether the Canadian orchestra deserved the hype that preceded it. Backstage, Elliot adjusted his tie for the 10th time, his hands trembling slightly. Sophia stood beside him, reviewing the final program. "Maestro, 5 minutes." "Are you ready?" "No, but let's go anyway." He walked onto the stage where the orchestra was already in place. The musicians greeted him with respectful nods, and he saw on each of their faces the same mix of nerves and excitement he felt himself. His eyes found Bonnie. She was seated in the first chair, elegant in her black dress, her hair pulled back into a sophisticated bun, her violin perfectly poised. And when their eyes met, she smiled, a small private smile that said everything that needed to be said. "I'm here. We're in this together. You're not alone." Elliot stepped onto the podium, the familiar weight of the baton in his hand. The curtains parted, and the audience erupted into polite applause. He gave a brief bow, then turned to the orchestra. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to look at them all. Not as pieces on a chessboard he needed to control, but as people, artists, companions on this journey. And then he raised the baton, and the music began. It was Mahler, Symphony No. 5, a work of brutal complexity and devastating beauty, built on layers of emotion that ranged from profound despair to transcendent hope. The orchestra responded with a precision forged by months of labor, but also with a passion that could only come from musicians who truly believed in what they were doing. And Elliot conducted not with the rigid control he had clung to for years, but with a fluidity that allowed the music to breathe, to grow, to transform into something alive. He let himself feel every note, every phrase, every emotion Mahler had woven into that score more than a century ago. When it came time for Bonnie's solo in the fourth movement, the famous Adagietto, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. It was a piece of almost painful beauty, a simple yet profoundly emotional melody that had been used in films, at funerals, in moments of ultimate gravity. And Bonnie played it as if every note were a love letter. Elliot watched her, the baton nearly forgotten, utterly hypnotized. Her eyes were closed, completely lost in the music, and he could see in her expression every emotion the melody carried: love, loss, hope, acceptance. It was as if she were telling their story through the strings of her violin. And somehow, impossible to explain, he felt that Natalie was there too. Not as a ghost or haunting, but as a peaceful presence, blessing what he had found, approving the way he had finally allowed life back in. And then it happened. In the middle of the movement, Elliot caught something out of the corner of his eye. A figure in the front row, discreetly rising. He almost ignored it, focused on the music. But something about the way the man moved caught his attention. It was a man, age indeterminate, dark hair, wearing a gray suit, and he was staring directly at Elliot with an intensity that was almost physical. For a split second, their eyes met, and in that look, Elliot saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition, and something that looked like guilt. The man turned and slipped quietly out through the side aisle. Elliot nearly stopped conducting, nearly let the baton fall, but years of discipline took over. He continued mechanically, while his mind was miles away. Who was that man? Why did he look familiar? And why did the way he stared at Elliot feel weighted with unspoken secrets? Bonnie finished the solo, and the audience erupted in mid-movement applause. Something rare, a testament to how deeply moved they were. Elliot motioned for her to stand, and she did, accepting the recognition with grace. But when she looked at Elliot, she saw something on his face that alarmed her. Worry, fear, confusion. The rest of the concert passed in a haze. Elliot conducted on autopilot, his professional side taking over while his mind spun endlessly around the image of that mysterious man and the look he had given. When the final note was played and the audience rose in a standing ovation, Elliot could barely process it. He bowed as required, gestured toward the orchestra, accepted the endless applause. But the moment the curtains closed, he stepped down from the podium and bolted into the audience, ignoring Sophia's calls and the puzzled questions of the musicians. He reached the lobby, desperately scanning for the man in the gray suit. But there were hundreds of people, all in formal attire, all chatting animatedly about the concert, and the man had vanished completely. Elliot stood frozen, his heart pounding erratically, his mind whirling with questions he couldn't answer. Elliot. Bonnie ran up to him. What happened? Why did you run off? He turned to her, and she saw in his eyes something that frightened her. Not just confusion, but something close to panic. There was a man in the front row. He looked at me and, I don't know, something was wrong. Something familiar but strange at the same time. And the way he looked at me, the way he looked at you, how? Like someone carrying guilt. Like someone who knows something I don't. Bonnie touched his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. Elliot, are you okay? You need to breathe. But before he could answer, Sophia came running. Maestro! You need to come back right now. The Vienna representatives want to speak with you. And there's someone else who insists on seeing you. Says it's urgent. Who? He wouldn't give his name. He only said you met 4 years ago. In Milan, Elliot's world stopped spinning. The man was waiting in a private room backstage at the Royal Albert Hall. Elliot entered with Bonnie at his side, refusing to leave her outside despite her protests that maybe he needed privacy. He had spent too much time alone. He wasn't ready to go back to that. The man stood as they walked in. It was the same one Elliot had seen in the audience. Gray suit, dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, a face lined with years of worry. Maestro Holden, he said, his voice heavy with an Italian accent. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I didn't agree. I only came because they told me you were in Milan. That night. The man nodded, eyes dropping to his own hands. My name is James Rossini. I was the stage manager at La Scala that night, and I've carried something with me for 4 years that I should have told you immediately." Elliot felt Bonnie squeeze his hand, anchoring him. This moment of truth about his past, about secrets long kept, was about to change everything he believed about the tragedy he had lived through. "What do you know about my wife's death?" James drew in a deep breath as if preparing to leap off a cliff. "Your wife didn't just die of an aneurysm, or rather the aneurysm is what killed her. But there was something else. Something I saw and never told anyone because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, my reputation, my life." "Say it," Elliot said, his voice dangerously low. 2 weeks before the concert, a man showed up at the theater. He said he was a fan, wanted to meet your wife. I let him backstage because he seemed harmless, well-dressed, polite. He spoke with her for maybe 10 minutes. I didn't hear what they said, but I saw her face change. She went pale, frightened. Elliot's heart pounded at his temples. This revelation about the past, this secret buried for years, was finally surfacing. And after that day, he came back several times. Always the same man, always brief conversations. And every time he left, she seemed more unsettled. I asked her once if she was all right, if she wanted me to call security. She said no, that he was just an old acquaintance, nothing important. Who was he? I don't know his name. But on the night of the concert, he was there, in the audience. And when she collapsed, when the chaos started, I saw him get up and leave. Not running, just leaving, as if he knew what was about to happen. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Elliot processed the words, trying to make sense of them. This love story between the maestro and the violinist was about to gain a new dimension, a deeper understanding of the scars he carried. "You're suggesting someone caused the aneurysm? That's impossible. Aneurysms don't work like that." "I know." The doctors said the same thing. "But Maestro, your wife was visibly stressed in the weeks before the concert. She had constant headaches, wasn't sleeping, and extreme stress can trigger aneurysms in people who are predisposed." I researched it later, became obsessed with it. Bonnie finally spoke. "Why are you telling this now? After 4 years?" James looked at her, genuine gratitude in his eyes for asking the question he clearly feared. "Because I saw you on the news. I saw the orchestra was on tour, and I thought maybe Maestro Holden deserved to know the truth, or at least the truth as I know it. And also because..." He hesitated. "Because I recently found out I'm sick. Terminal cancer, and I don't want to die carrying this secret." Elliot sank heavily into a chair, his head in his hands. 4 years. For 4 years, he had believed Natalie's death was just cruel bad luck, and now he was discovering that perhaps someone had contributed to it. This twist in the maestro and the violinist's story showed that sometimes love must confront not only the present but also the ghosts of the past. "Do you have any idea who this man was? Any description, anything?" "Tall, graying hair, American accent, well-dressed, military bearing, and there was something in his eyes, something cold, like someone used to getting what he wants no matter the cost." A memory surfaced in Elliot's mind. Natalie had mentioned something weeks before Milan, something about an old acquaintance who had resurfaced. He hadn't paid attention, too busy with rehearsals, with preparations. He had ignored the signs, her headaches, her mounting stress, and she had died. "I should have seen it," he said. "She tried to tell me something was wrong, and I was too busy to listen." Bonnie knelt in front of him, holding his face in both hands. This moment of the maestro's vulnerability, this confession of his deepest guilt, was exactly the kind of emotional scene that struck the heart of anyone who had ever loved and lost someone. "No, you don't do that. You don't take the blame for something you couldn't control. Even if this man contributed to her stress, you couldn't have known." "No one could, but I should have." "There is no should have. There's only what happened. And you can't change that. All you can do is decide how to live with it." James stood, pulling an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket. "I brought security photos from that night. I got copies before I left La Scala. Maybe they'll help identify the man. And Maestro," he extended the envelope. "I'm sorry. For not saying anything sooner. For being a coward." Elliot took the envelope but didn't open it, not yet. Not when his hands were trembling, and his vision was blurred with tears he refused to let fall. "Thank you for finally telling me, for trying to make things right. I hope it brings you some peace, and that your music stays beautiful." Tonight was transcendent. She would have been proud. James left, leaving Elliot and Bonnie alone in the heavy silence of the room. They stayed like that for a long time. She still kneeling in front of him, her hands holding his and an anchor in the storm. This emotional scene between them showed that true love is the kind that remains even when we discover painful truths about the past. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to investigate, find out who this man was, confront him. But another part knows it won't change anything. Natalie is still gone. And if I spend the next few years obsessed with vengeance or justice, I'll just lose more time I could be living. Then choose to live. Choose to move forward, not because you've forgotten her, or because the pain doesn't matter anymore, but because you deserve to be happy again. And she would want that for you." Elliot finally looked at Bonnie, truly looked, and saw not just the woman he loved, but the future. The possibility of better days, of music made with joy instead of only discipline, of a life that was more than mere survival. This decisive moment in the Maestro's story marked the complete transformation of a man who had chosen love over fear. "Marry me?" he said, the words spilling out before he could think them. Bonnie's eyes widened. "What? Marry me? I know it's soon. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is madness, but I also know you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I don't want to wait. I don't want to lose more time to fear or caution. I want to wake up every day knowing you're mine and I'm yours." Tears streamed down her face now, but her smile was pure sunrise. This unexpected proposal, made in a backstage room in London, was proof that sometimes the most romantic moments happen when we least expect them. That is the most unromantic marriage proposal I've ever heard. In a backstage room after you've just uncovered terrible secrets about your late wife. No ring, no preparation. I know, I'm terrible at this. But is the answer yes? Obviously yes, you idiot. Yes now, tomorrow, always. He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of tears and promises and new beginnings. And when they parted, both laughing, Elliot knew he had made the right decision. To live. Finally, completely live. 5 years had passed since that transformative moment in London. The life of the maestro and the violinist had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined on that first rehearsal day, when she defied every rule he had set. Now, on a quiet Saturday morning in Toronto, a new story was being written. A story about family, lasting love, and the beauty of starting over. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of organized chaos that had become familiar. Elliot woke to a small weight bouncing on his stomach, high-pitched giggles filling the bedroom he and Bonnie shared in their home in Rosedale, one of Toronto's most charming neighborhoods. "Daddy, Daddy, wake up." Grandma Sophia said we're having pancakes today. He opened his eyes to find his 3-year-old daughter, Daniela, standing on top of him, her wild curls identical to her mother's, his own gray eyes sparkling with morning excitement. This little child was living proof that true love not only heals old wounds, but creates new beginnings full of joy and hope. "Good morning, little one," he said, his voice still husky with sleep, pulling her into a hug that made her squeal with delight. "Elliot, you're spoiling her again." Bonnie appeared in the doorway, wearing flannel pajamas and balancing their 6-month-old son, Thomas, on her hip. She was stunning even without makeup, with tousled hair and sleepy eyes. The violinist who had once revolutionized the orchestra was now also a mother, a wife, and still the most talented musician Elliot had ever known. "I'm not spoiling her, just being a loving father. You melt like butter when it comes to her and you know it. Guilty. We made 2 children impossible to resist." Daniela had already wriggled free and dashed down the stairs, probably toward the kitchen where Sophia, who had become not just an assistant but an honorary grandmother, was making Saturday breakfast. Elliot got up and walked to Bonnie, kissing her first and then Thomas's forehead, the baby sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the chaos around him. "Good morning, family," he murmured against her lips. "Good morning, Maestro. Ready for another day of complete domestic anarchy?" "Always." They went downstairs together and Elliot looked around the house they had bought 2 years earlier. It was far too big with too many rooms, but Bonnie had insisted they needed space for the children to grow. and he hadn't been able to say no, especially when she had that spark in her eyes that meant she had already decided. This house represented everything he had rebuilt, the happy life that had risen from the ashes of tragedy. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Sophia was indeed making pancakes, while Daniela sat on the counter helping, in a way that probably slowed things down more than anything else. Stephen was there too. Of course he was, sitting at the table, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee as if he lived there. "Good morning, Holden family," Stephen greeted cheerfully. "And yes, before you ask, I used my key again. You really should stop giving me keys if you don't want me showing up unannounced." "We'll stop giving you keys when you stop showing up with French croissants," Bonnie replied, pointing to the expensive bakery box on the table. "Touché." Elliot sat at the table, taking Thomas from Bonnie's arms while she went to help Sophia. He looked down at his son, this small, perfect miracle he hadn't always been sure he wanted, but now couldn't imagine life without. Thomas had his mother's eyes, honey-colored with golden flecks, and already seemed to have inherited his father's calm temperament, or at least that was Elliot's hope, because Daniela had enough energy for 3 children. "Daddy, after breakfast, will you play piano with me?" Daniela asked with her mouth full of pancake. "Don't talk with your mouth full, sweetheart," Bonnie corrected automatically. "And of course Daddy will play with you." He loves playing with you, and it was true. Elliot had returned to the piano after years of avoiding the instrument so closely tied to Natalie. But Daniela had shown an early interest in music, and he couldn't resist teaching her. Somehow doing so had been healing, as if he were honoring Natalie's memory by passing on the love of music they had once shared. This connection across generations through music showed how the legacy of true love lives on in unexpected, beautiful ways. Breakfast unfolded in a chaotic mix of overlapping conversations, spilled milk, laughter, and the kind of mess only big families can create. And Elliot wouldn't have traded it for anything. This portrait of a happy family was the complete opposite of the loneliness he had endured for years. The proof that choosing love over fear had been the most important decision of his life. Later, after Stephen had left and Sophia had taken Daniela to the park, Elliot and Bonnie were alone in the music studio they had set up upstairs. Thomas slept in a portable crib in the corner, and they savored the rare moment of calm. Bonnie picked up her violin, the one that had belonged to her grandmother and survived so much. Elliot sat at the piano, his fingers finding the keys with a familiarity that had taken years to recover. "What do you want to play?" he asked. "Our song." He knew immediately which one she meant. The piece she had improvised that night 5 years earlier, when they were still learning how to be vulnerable with each other. They had worked on it together ever since, refining, expanding, turning it into something complete. This original composition by the maestro and the violinist was more than just notes on a score. It was their story. Translated into melody, Elliot began to play and Bonnie joined in, the violin conversing with the piano in an intimate dialogue only they truly understood. It was music about pain and healing, about loss and discovery, about 2 broken people who had found a way to mend together. When they finished, Bonnie set the violin aside and sat down on the bench next to him. "Are you happy?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. "More than I ever thought I could be again." "Good, because I am too. And I still think you're impossible sometimes. You know? And I still think you're the most frustrating and wonderful thing that's ever happened to me. Perfect balance." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent she had never changed. "You know what day it is today? Saturday?" "Yes, but it also marks 5 years since that concert in London. Since the night everything changed." Bonnie lifted her head, surprised. "I hadn't realized. It feels like a lifetime ago." "It does, but I still remember every detail. The fear I felt, the revelation about Natalie, proposing to you in that awful backstage room. It was romantic in your strange, traumatized way." He laughed because she was right. "I never did find out who that man was. The one James described. Part of me still wonders sometimes. And the other part? The other part knows it doesn't matter anymore. Natalie is gone. I honor her memory by living well, by being happy, by loving you and our children with everything I have, and I think she would have approved. I think she would have loved all of this. The music, the chaos, the kids, especially the kids. Thomas chose that moment to wake, crying with the particular outrage of babies who decide the world must immediately know their dissatisfaction. There's our little Maestro. Bonnie got up to pick him up, always knowing how to make a dramatic entrance. Elliot watched her lift their son, calming him with that natural ease he still found astonishing. She hummed softly, a melody he recognized as part of the piece they had just played, and he realized with a clarity that was almost physical that he had done it. He had rebuilt a life after tragedy. He had learned to love again without betraying the memory of the one he had lost. He had managed to be a father, a husband, a maestro, a man. He had managed to be whole again. This journey of transformation, from a lonely maestro to a happy, fulfilled man, was proof that it is never too late to start over, never too late to choose love. 2 years later, in yet another turn in the story of the maestro and the violinist, came the moment that would define their legacy not only as musicians, but as a couple who had overcome every adversity. The Roy Thompson Hall was packed for the special year-end concert. 7 years since Bonnie had first walked into that hall and turned Elliot's life upside down. But today was different. Today wasn't just another concert. Today was special. Elliot stepped onto the podium to enthusiastic applause. The orchestra was in place, including many new faces but also the familiar ones. Stephen at the piano, always there. June, who had become a close friend after years of forgotten rivalry. Sophia in the audience with Daniela and Thomas, now 5 and 2 years old respectively. And Bonnie in the first chair, where she had always been since that first day. But today she wouldn't be playing alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elliot said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight is a special concert, not only because we celebrate 7 incredible years with this orchestra, but because we will be presenting a new piece. An original composition." Murmurs of interest rippled through the audience. The idea of an original composition created by the maestro and his first violinist stirred anticipation, especially knowing the love story and resilience behind that musical partnership. This piece was written by 2 people, my wife Bonnie and myself. It's about journeys, about loss and discovery, about how music can save us when everything else fails, and about love. Love that endures, that heals, that transforms. He paused, his eyes finding Bonnie's. "We call it After the Silence, because it's about what comes after we allow the world back in, after we choose to live instead of merely survive." He raised the baton, and the music began. It was unlike anything they had ever played before. It began with silence, just a few seconds, and then soft as breath the piano entered. Elliot's melody, simple yet profound. Then Bonnie's violin joined in, conversing with the piano, complimenting, challenging, dancing around it. It was their story in music. The initial clash, the resistance, the slow surrender, the final eruption of emotion. This emotional performance by the musical couple touched every heart in the audience, reminding them that true love is worth every sacrifice, every fear overcome. The orchestra joined gradually, each section adding layers until the entire hall vibrated with sound. It was controlled chaos, beauty built on complexity, exactly as their lives had become. And at the climax of the piece, Elliot did something he had never done before. He lowered the baton and turned toward the audience while the orchestra continued to play. They had memorized this section for this exact moment. He stepped down from the podium and walked toward Bonnie. She kept playing, but her eyes were on him, a silent question in them. And there, in front of hundreds of people in the middle of a concert, Elliot did something completely inappropriate and perfectly right. He kissed her. It wasn't a long or improper kiss. It was simple, brief, but charged with 7 years of love and struggle and growth. And when they parted, the audience erupted in applause even as the music still played. This unforgettable moment, the maestro kissing the violinist in the middle of a concert, would become viral. The most beautiful love story in the world of classical music, proving that sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what we need to do. Bonnie was laughing, the violin forgotten for a moment. "You just broke every rule of concert etiquette," she said, but she was smiling. "Learned from the best," he replied. returning to the podium to conduct the final measures. The music ended on a sustained note that seemed to float in the air for an eternity before finally dissolving into silence. And then the hall erupted, people on their feet clapping, cheering, shouting, because they hadn't just witnessed excellent music. They had witnessed something rarer. They had witnessed true love, the kind that survives tragedy, overcomes fear, and chooses every single day to keep choosing. This inspiring story of love and music showed that it is never too late to begin again, that true love always triumphs, and that sometimes the best stories are the ones that remind us it's worth risking your heart. Backstage, after it was all over and the audience had finally dispersed, Elliot and Bonnie sat alone on the empty stage. He sat at the piano bench. She leaned against him, the violin resting in her hand. "So," she said, 7 years. "Do you regret anything? Only not having had the courage to kiss you sooner?" "Liar, you needed that time." "We both did. Maybe. But now that we're here, I can't imagine it happening any other way." "Neither can I." They fell silent, listening to the sounds of the theater settling around them. Somewhere, Sophia was taking the children home. Somewhere, Stephen was probably making jokes about the public kiss. Somewhere, life went on. But here, on the stage where it had all begun, where Elliot had been forced to confront his fears and Bonnie had proven she was worth the risk, they simply existed, together, whole. This was the happy ending everyone deserves. The proof that true love exists and is worth fighting for. "I love you," Elliot said, because even after 7 years, the words still carried power. "I love you too. Even when you're annoying, even when we argue about musical interpretations, even when you let Daniela manipulate you into giving her extra dessert. I don't let her manipulate me." "Yes, you do. Yesterday, she got you to give her 3 ice creams." She asked politely. "She completely wrapped you around her finger and you know it." He laughed, pulling her closer. "Fine. Maybe I'm a little soft when it comes to her. But can you blame me? She has your eyes. And your smile. And that way of tilting her head when she wants something. It's genetically impossible to say no. You're going to raise a spoiled monster. We'll raise a spoiled monster together, as it should be." Bonnie turned to face him, her hands going to his face the way they always did when she wanted his full attention. "You know what I find incredible? That all of this almost didn't happen. If you hadn't given me that chance, if I had walked away when you were being a complete jerk, if any one of the 1,000 little choices we made had been different. But they weren't. And here we are. And I would choose it all again. Every hard moment, every fight, every tear, because they all led to this. To what? To you, to us. To a life worth living." She kissed him then, soft and sweet. And he felt the same thing he always felt when she kissed him, as if the world made sense. As if all the broken pieces had finally found where they belonged. This final kiss, filled with promises and gratitude, sealed the most beautiful love story of music and devotion anyone could imagine. When they pulled apart, Bonnie rested her forehead against his. "So, Maestro, what's the next movement?" Elliot smiled. That full smile he had forgotten how to make until she walked into his life and reminded him. "The next movement is always the same. We keep playing. We keep living. We keep loving. 'Cause in the end, it's all about the music we make together. And ours is the most beautiful I've ever heard. Even with all the wrong notes and chaotic improvisations. Especially because of them. Perfection is overrated. I'd rather have what's real." "Good," she said, rising and extending her hand to him. "Because real is all I have to offer." Elliot took her hand, standing and pulling her into one last embrace. "It's all I've ever wanted." They walked off the stage together, hands intertwined, leaving the empty theater behind but carrying with them everything that mattered. Love, music, future. And in the quiet that remained, if someone listened closely enough, they might swear they heard an echo. Not of the music that had been played, but of the music still to come. Of stories still untold. Of life still waiting to be lived. Because some endings aren't really endings. They are only the beginning of a new movement. And this one was only just beginning. This moving story of the maestro who learned to love again. Of the rebellious violinist who changed everything. Of the true love that overcame tragedy and fear. Proves that it is never too late to start over. That love always wins. That music can heal even the deepest wounds. And that sometimes the best stories are the ones that remind us it is worth risking the heart. Because true love exists, waiting for those brave enough to set fear aside and choose to live fully. So what did you think of this emotional love story? Maestro broken by pain, a violinist who defies his rules, and music as a force powerful enough to change lives. If this story made you sigh, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to catch our next intense and passionate love stories. I'd love to read your comments. Tell me below which part moved you the most and help hype up the video. That really supports the channel and helps our soul-stirring romantic stories reach more people. Thank you for always being here with us. See you in the next story.